She was 26 years old, 130 pounds, and she had killed 19 people. Not in combat, not in self-defense, on orders. Every target had a file. Every file said the same thing: national threat, imminent danger, authorized termination. She never read past the authorization codes. She never needed to. Until the night she transmitted coordinates to headquarters, and 6 soldiers walked into a kill zone that shouldn't have existed. They found the bodies at dawn. The report called it an enemy ambush. Rowan Hale knew better. She had built the trap without knowing it. And the people who used her were still out there, still writing files, still authorizing targets, still looking for someone willing to pull the trigger without asking why. If this story hits you somewhere real, follow the channel, hit like, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. The bus from the depot smelled like diesel and wet canvas, and Rowan Hale sat alone in the last row with her kit bag between her feet and her rifle case across her knees, and said nothing the entire 4-hour drive to Fort Blackstone. Nobody talked to her. Nobody tried. There were 11 other soldiers on that bus. Reassignments, transfers, a couple of fresh faces still carrying the rigid posture of recent training cycles. They talked over each other the way soldiers do when they're nervous and don't want to show it, loud, crude, full of abbreviations nobody outside the wire would understand. 2 guys in the middle row were arguing about the best CQB entry technique for a tight urban hallway. A woman near the front was cleaning her sidearm with the methodical patience of someone who'd done it 1,000 times and found it soothing. Rowan watched the road. Fort Blackstone materialized out of the morning fog like a bruise. Low concrete structures, chain link topped with concertina wire, a guard post with 2 MPs who waved the bus through without making eye contact. The mountains behind the installation were invisible in the overcast, just a gray suggestion of mass and altitude pressing down on everything below. She hadn't been assigned to a conventional unit in 3 years. She wasn't sure she remembered how. The processing sergeant was a heavy-set staff sergeant named Dillard, who looked at her transfer paperwork the way a man looks at a check he doesn't believe will clear. Specialist Hale. He said it flat, not a question. Yes, Sergeant. Says here you're coming in from a detached assignment. He turned the page, turned it back. Doesn't say where. No, Sergeant, it wouldn't. Dillard looked up at her. He had the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by things years ago, but something in his expression shifted slightly. Not suspicion, exactly. More like recalibration. You request this posting? I was assigned. Right. He stamped the form, slid it back across the desk. Welcome to Fort Blackstone. Try not to make anyone feel bad about themselves. She picked up the paperwork. I'll do my best. He watched her walk out. She could feel it. Her bunk was in the far corner of Barrack C, a lower rack against the wall that someone had vacated recently enough that the mattress still held the shape of whoever had slept there before. She stowed her kit with the same economy of movement she applied to everything. No wasted motion, no rearranging, no personal items placed on the shelf above. The rifle case went under the bunk. The kit bag went inside the locker. She sat on the edge of the mattress and read the unit orientation packet from cover to cover. She was halfway through the range qualification schedule when the door opened. 3 of them. All male, all somewhere in the sergeant range, all carrying the casual confidence of men who own a space and know it. The one in front was taller than the other 2, built like he'd been put together from mismatched parts. Long arms, wide shoulders, a jaw that looked like it had absorbed some significant impacts over the years. His name tape said Cross. He looked at her the way people look at something that doesn't belong in the frame. You're in Nguyen's bunk, he said. Nguyen transferred out, Rowan said without looking up from the packet. 3 weeks ago. His name is no longer on the bunk assignment sheet. How do you know when he transferred? I read the unit roster on the way in. Cross glanced back at the other 2. Something passed between them. Not hostile exactly. More like amusement that hadn't fully committed to a direction yet. You always read the unit roster before you unpack. Saves time. The guy on Cross's left, shorter, stockier, a tattoo of something geometric on the back of his left hand, snorted. Not meanly, more like he found it genuinely funny and couldn't decide whether to respect it or not. Cross leaned against the bunk frame across from hers. He wasn't threatening. He was sizing her up, doing it openly, without any particular effort to hide it. "What's in the case?" "My rifle." "What kind?" She looked up at him then, not confrontationally, just directly. "The kind that reaches things other rifles don't." Cross was quiet for a second, then, "You a sniper?" "I'm a specialist." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer on my transfer paperwork." He straightened up, looked her over one more time. The compact frame, the rifle case, the fact that she was sitting perfectly still without any of the tension most people carry when strangers crowd their personal space. "All right," he said. It sounded like something he hadn't fully decided yet. He jerked his head at the other two and they filed back out. At the door he paused. "Chow's at 1800. If you're late, you eat whatever's left." "Noted." He left. Rowan went back to the packet. Master Sergeant Victor Kane ran the company's reconnaissance and fire support element, which meant he was responsible for a subset of soldiers that included long-range shooters, forward observers, and the kind of specialists who got attached to units for operations that didn't appear in standard briefings. He was 51, lean in the way people get when they've been eating field rations and burning calories on mountainsides for 30 years. His face had the texture of someone who'd spent a lot of time outdoors in bad weather. His eyes were pale, not blue exactly, more like the color of overcast sky, and they moved constantly, the unconscious habit of a man who had spent decades cataloging threat information from his environment. He saw Rowan's transfer packet at 1400 on her first day. He read it twice. Then he walked to the window of his office, which looked out over the motor pool, and stood there for a long time without doing anything. The packet told him almost nothing. Detached assignment, undisclosed location, 3 years. Qualified. Expert rating. On the M110 semi-automatic sniper system, the Barrett M82, and a suppressed variant of the M2010 that didn't appear in standard equipment catalogs. Psychological evaluation. Within normal parameters. With a footnote he'd seen once before in a different file that simply read, adapted to operational environment. He'd seen that footnote exactly once before, in the file of a man who had later been involved in something he still wasn't allowed to discuss. Kane set the packet down on his desk and went back to what he'd been doing, but he thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. The unit's first collective range day came on a Thursday, cold and overcast, with a wind out of the northwest that cut across the firing line at an angle that made every shooter compensate differently depending on where they were positioned. The range ran to 800 meters on the primary line, with a secondary course set up in the hills behind the installation that pushed closer to 1400. The exercise was qualification plus, standard groupings at distance, then a timed scenario that involved multiple targets appearing at randomized intervals across the range face. Rowan drew a lane between Cross and a quiet private named Espinoza, who shot with the focused stillness of someone who'd trained for it since childhood. Cross was good, genuinely good, the kind of shooter who made it look effortless, who read wind without checking the meter, who acquired and settled in a single smooth motion. He put 5 rounds into a group at 600 that any range officer would have been proud of. He went to 1200 and the wind shifted and he pulled 3 inches left on his 4th shot. Not dramatically wrong, just wrong enough. He worked the bolt and reset and took the 5th shot and corrected it, which told you he understood what had happened and why. But the correction came after the mistake, and in a real engagement, there was no such thing as a corrective 5th shot. He knew it too. You could tell from the way he stayed prone after the shot, staring downrange, not angry, just aware of the gap between where he was and where he needed to be. Rowan was 2 lanes over. She had been watching the wind indicators at the 300, 600, and 1,000 meter mark since she set up. Not the flags. She'd stopped relying on flags years ago. The grass, the way the spotting scope's reticle shimmered at distance, the behavior of the dust on the berm. She settled. The math wasn't complicated, but the variables were stacked. 1,400 meters, a crosswind with a consistent base of 11 to 13 kilometers per hour, and a secondary gust pattern running roughly every 40 to 60 seconds. She'd timed 4 cycles while Cross was shooting. Temperature drop from when she'd checked the weather report that morning. Slight elevation differential, which the range didn't account for in its official data because most shooters on this line weren't shooting at this distance. She waited for the gust to pass. She fired. The round hit inside the 3-inch ring at 1,400 meters in a crosswind on the first shot, and then she worked the bolt and did it again. Dead silence on the firing line. Not the silence of inattention, the other kind. The silence of people recalibrating. The range officer, a sergeant first class named Okafor, was standing behind the line with his clipboard, and he didn't write anything down for a long moment. He just looked at the target data on his screen, looked at Rowan, looked at the screen again. "Second lane," he said, mostly to himself. "Mark those." Cross had rolled to his side and was looking at her from 2 lanes over, not the sizing up look from the barracks. Something else. Something that hadn't decided yet what it was. "First try?" he said. "Yes." "What was your wind reading?" 11 base, gust cycling at about 50-second intervals. I waited for the trough. He was quiet, looked downrange, looked back at her. "You didn't use the meter?" "No." "How long have you been shooting?" She started breaking down her position. "Long enough." Kane had been watching from the observer's platform behind the line. He'd watched Rowan's entire string of fire, not just the last 2 shots that everybody noticed, but from the beginning. The way she'd set up, the way she'd read the wind, the stillness, which wasn't the stillness of someone suppressing nerves. It was something different, something that came from the inside out. He came down off the platform after the exercise wrapped, and the soldiers were policing their brass. He didn't approach her, he just watched her move. Efficient, unhurried, no wasted effort. She picked up her brass. She checked her weapon before bagging it. She noted something in a small notebook she kept in her left breast pocket, something he couldn't read from the distance he was standing at. He'd seen shooters who were technically better than good. He'd seen shooters who were exceptional. He'd seen one, exactly one, who moved through the world with the particular quality he was watching now, which wasn't confidence exactly, or discipline exactly, or even experience. It was the quality of someone who had been doing something serious for a long time, something that mattered, and who had arranged their entire relationship with themselves around the requirements of that thing. In his experience, that quality didn't develop in training pipelines. It developed in operational environments. He turned and walked back toward the installation. The common room in the NCO quarters had a television that nobody watched, and a card table that always had people at it, and a coffee maker that produced something that technically qualified as coffee, the way a participation trophy technically qualified as an achievement. Rowan sat at the far end of the common room with her notebook and a cup of the coffee, which she drank without complaint because complaint required either a better option or the energy to care about having one. She was mapping the range data from the day. Wind patterns, timing, the correction variance at different distance bands. Not because she needed to. She'd internalized most of it during the exercise. More because the act of writing things down gave her hands something to do and gave her brain somewhere specific to be, which kept it from going to the places it went when she left it unoccupied. Cross came in at 2100 with 2 other guys from the platoon, grabbed coffee, looked around the room, and settled at the card table. He glanced over at Rowan once but didn't say anything. The other 2 guys were already laying out cards. 20 minutes later, one of them, the one with the geometric tattoo, whose name turned out to be Delaney, called over, "Hale, you play?" She didn't look up from the notebook. "Depends on the game." "Rummy. Nothing complicated." "I'm good. Suit yourself." They played for a while. Rowan kept writing. She was aware of being watched occasionally. Not aggressively, just the way people in a small shared space monitor newcomers, building an ambient sense of who they are. She was used to it. Around 2200, Cross said, "Where were you before this?" He said it casually, not looking at her, sorting his hand. "Detached assignment," Rowan said. "Right. That's what your paperwork says." He discarded. "I'm asking where you actually were." "I know what you're asking." Silence. Delaney picked up the card Cross had discarded, examined it, put it back. "You don't want to tell me," Cross said. "It wasn't accusing, just noting." "I can't tell you." "Classified." "Yes." He considered that for a moment. "Were you shooting?" Rowan closed the notebook. "What do you think I was doing?" Cross looked at her then. Full attention, no performance in it. "I think you were somewhere that required the kind of shooting you did today, and that nobody there was practicing for qualification. She held his gaze. You're good at reading situations. I'm also good at reading people. He went back to his cards. You were operational, something long range. And either it ended or they moved you, and either way, you're not happy about being here. I don't have feelings about it. That's not true. That's the end of this conversation. He shrugged. Okay. Laid down a set. Rummy. Delaney swore. She ran at 5:30 every morning. The route she chose went out through the eastern gate, along the service road that paralleled the fence line, then up the switchback trail that climbed the first ridge and came back down the other side. It was 6 kilometers, with about 280 meters of elevation gain, and she did it in 38 minutes without stopping. On the 4th morning, Cross was at the gate when she got back. He had clearly been running himself. His shirt was dark with sweat. His breathing was coming down from elevated, but he'd come from the main installation loop, which was flat and considerably shorter. He was standing at the gate with a water bottle, looking at the trail she'd come down from. That goes up to the first ridge, he said. Yes, in the dark. It's not dark anymore. He handed her the water bottle without her asking. She took it, drank, handed it back. The first time you went up there, he said. How did you know the route? I didn't. I mapped it as I went. In the dark. Headlamp. He looked at the trail again, then at her. You're different from the shooters I've worked with before. Different how? The good ones are usually... He stopped, started again. The good long-range guys I've known, they're methodical, precise, kind of... He made a gesture that encompassed something invisible. Contained, like all that focus goes inward. And? You're focused, but it's not inward. It's like you're reading everything outward, all the time, even now. He paused. You just checked the tree line twice since I started talking. She hadn't realized she'd done it. She had. Operational habit, she said. Yeah? He capped the water bottle. What happened on your last deployment? She started walking toward the barracks. Hale. She kept walking. The first major exercise was called Iron Veil, and it ran across 3 days in the mountain terrain north of the installation where the forest was thick enough that visibility dropped to under 50 meters in the draws and hollows, and where the rain that came in on the second night turned every slope into something that required both hands and careful attention to navigate without falling. The exercise simulated a reconnaissance in force mission, a company-sized element pushing through contested terrain to establish an observation post at a ridgeline that had been designated as a strategic overwatch position. Opposition forces, OP-4, played by a separate unit out of another installation, were seated throughout the area of operation. The rules of engagement were training ROE, marking rounds only, body cameras on every OPFOR soldier, judges positioned at key points to call hits and assess outcomes. Rowan was assigned to the fire support element under Kane, paired with Cross as her spotter. This was, she suspected, Kane's decision rather than an administrative coincidence. They moved out at 0400 on day 1, Kane's element pushing out to the left flank of the company's axis of advance. The terrain was worse than the maps suggested. The contour lines didn't fully capture the nature of the undergrowth, which in places was thick enough to require deviation from the planned route. Cross navigated with the combination of the digital terrain model on his handheld device and the kind of practical map reading that came from having done it in worse conditions than this. He was good in the field, better, she thought, than on the range, which was interesting because range performance and field performance didn't always correlate. Some shooters who excelled in the controlled environment fell apart when variables started multiplying. Cross got sharper. They established their first position in the pre-dawn dark, in a shallow depression behind a granite outcropping that gave them an oblique view of the valley below. The fog was heavy and sitting low, which degraded their optics but also degraded the OP-4's ability to detect them, so it balanced. Thermal's going to pick up anyone moving in that draw, Cross said quietly. He had the spotting scope on a bipod, helmet off, prone in the pine duff. They'll want to come through the tree line on the left edge, harder to glass. They already have, Rowan said. Cross moved the scope, stopped. I don't see movement. 11 o'clock from the dead pine, 3 of them. They've been still for 8 minutes. He adjusted, looked for another long moment. How are you? He stopped. She heard the recognition arrive in his breathing. I see them. They're practically invisible. The one in the center adjusted his position twice. Small movements, but they accumulated. You've been watching that spot since we set up. I've been watching everything since we set up. That spot produced information. Cross was quiet for a moment. Then, you call it to Kane, or you want to develop the picture first? She considered. Develop. 2 minutes. Copy. They lay in the wet pine needles in the pre-dawn cold, and Rowan tracked the three offer soldiers in the tree line and cross-referenced what she was seeing against the company's planned route, where the main element would be, what angle those three would have on it, what their mission was likely to be given their position and equipment load. They're not ambush, she said. They're an observation element. They're watching our flank to report, not to engage. Which means the ambush is further along. Higher on the ridgeline, north side of the saddle. That's where I'd put it. Cross keyed his radio. Actual. Overwatch. We have an OP4 observation element. 11 o'clock of the dead pine in grid Bravo 7. Assess there a relay for a larger element. Recommend main element hold at phase line 2 until we can confirm the saddle. Kane's voice came back. Copy. Overwatch. Hold and confirm. Break. What's your confidence level? Cross looked at Rowan. She said, high. He keyed the radio again. High confidence, actual. A pause. Then, hold for my call. Out. They held for 22 minutes. At the end of that time, the three OP4 in the tree line made contact by radio with an element on the north face of the saddle, and the OP4 control net transmitted on a frequency that the exercise judges were monitoring, and the judges assessed that the main element would have walked into a prepared ambush position at approximately grid Charlie 5 if they'd continued on the original route. Kane rerouted. They reached the ridgeline observation post 6 hours later. The OPF-4 never got their ambush. That evening, with the company in a defensive perimeter and the rain coming down steadily and everyone miserable and saturated, Cross lay in his sleeping bag in the shelter they'd erected with a chemical light and his notebook, and he looked at Rowan across the small space they were sharing. The dead pine thing, he said. How long had you been tracking that before you told me? About 4 minutes. Why didn't you say something right away? Because I wasn't sure yet what I was seeing. A movement that small could be anything. I needed the pattern. He wrote something in his notebook. How many observation points were you running simultaneously? She thought about it. 7 active sectors. Full tracking on 2. He set the notebook down and looked at the shelter ceiling, which was drumming with rain. That's not something they teach. No. Where does it come from? She was quiet for a moment. The rain was loud, and the chemical light gave everything a green-gray cast that made the interior of the shelter look like something from another era. You learn to do it, she said finally, when the cost of not doing it is very high. Cross looked at her. How high? She turned over in her bag and faced the wall and didn't answer. He didn't push it. Outside, the rain continued. Somewhere on the ridgeline, a radio squelched and went quiet. Rowan lay still and listened to the mountain, and thought about a night 6 months ago when she had transmitted coordinates into a handset and said, position confirmed, and then the 6 operators had moved, and then the shooting had started, and then it had stopped. And then there had been silence, and then more silence, and then a voice on the net saying, contact, wait out, and then nothing else. Just nothing else. She pressed her face into the material of the sleeping bag and kept her breathing even. Sleep didn't come for a long time. Ciao. The third day of Iron Veil produced the moment that changed everything. The company's objective was a communications node on the far side of the ridgeline, a mock installation set up by the exercise controllers, defended by a reinforced OP4 element with established positions and overlapping fields of fire. The assault element was going to approach from the west, which was the obvious axis and the one the OPFOR expected. Kane's fire support element was supposed to establish overwatch from a position to the south and suppress the defending force during the assault. Standard enough. But the OPFOR had placed a single hidden shooter, one of their best, as it turned out, in a position on the northern flank that covered the assault element's approach from an angle that the exercise planners hadn't fully anticipated. He was in a ghillie suit, in a position that merged so completely with the terrain that he had remained undetected through 2 aerial drone passes and a ground reconnaissance by a 3-man scout team. The assault started at 0900. Within 4 minutes, the hidden offer shooter began taking the assault element apart, methodically, efficiently, without revealing his position even as he fired. The marking rounds were registering kills in the assault's lead squad. The exercise judges were pulling people out of the line. The assault commander was on the net asking for fire support on the northern flank, but couldn't give a precise position because nobody could find the shooter. Cross scanned through the spotting scope. He had been scanning for 6 minutes and found nothing. "I've got nothing," he said, and there was real frustration in his voice. "He's good. He's not giving any signature." Rowan had been watching through her rifle scope, not the northern flank, the ground in front of it, the approaches, the vegetation patterns, the places where the terrain created natural positions that would offer both concealment and a line of fire on the assault element's route. She found it not through optics but through logic. The shot geometry required a specific elevation band. There was only one point on the northern flank that gave the angle on the assault element's route and concealment from the drone path and a stable firing surface. She'd mapped that geometry in her head while the assault was in prep stage, the way you learn to map geometry when you can't afford to be wrong. One position fit all 3 requirements. She put her scope on it. There was nothing visible. She waited. The ghillie suit was excellent, motion minimized, pattern broken, blending into the scrub with the kind of craft that came from long practice. But at some point, after making a shot, even the best shooters have to make a micro-adjustment to their position for the next one. Muscle doesn't hold perfect stillness indefinitely. The body compensates. The compensation produces movement. She waited for it. 11 seconds after his last shot, the OP4 shooter shifted, a 4-inch displacement of his upper body, barely visible even knowing where to look. Rowan's crosshairs were already there. She fired. The marking round hit. The exercise judges called the position. The assault element recovered. The OPF-4 hidden position collapsed. The objective fell 12 minutes later. Afterward, on the march back to the staging area, nobody said anything to Rowan directly. But there was a quality to the silence around her that was different from the first day silence in the barracks. That one had been dismissive. The silence of people who hadn't decided she was worth their attention. This was the silence of people recalibrating. Cross walked beside her for a while without saying anything. Then, "That shot." "Yes." "You located him through geometry." "Partly. The rest of it?" "Patience." He thought about that. Most shooters couldn't have held observation on a point that small for that long. They'd have started doubting themselves and moved on. "Doubt is expensive in this line of work." "Yeah." A pause. "Where did they train you to wait like that?" She watched the trail ahead of them. "They didn't. I trained myself." "How?" "By waiting in situations where moving too soon cost something real." He didn't press it further. Behind them, she could feel Kane watching. The debrief happened in the main operations building at 1700. The exercise controllers ran through the timeline, the hit assessments, the route deviations, and their outcomes. Cross took notes in his small, precise handwriting. The assault commander, a captain named Weller, gave credit where it was due and did it without performance, which Rowan thought well of. When they got to the hidden shooter incident, the exercise controller pulled up a map overlay. The position was assessed as effectively invisible by both aerial and ground reconnaissance prior to the assault phase. The fire support element located and neutralized it in 11 seconds of observable target movement. He looked at the room. "If anyone wants to unpack the method, I'd appreciate it. It's the most sophisticated hide location call I've seen in a training evolution in 3 years." Nobody spoke. Then Cross said, "It was Specialist Hale." Her analysis. Every head in the room turned. Rowan sat with her hands flat on the table and her posture composed and didn't do anything with the attention except receive it. "Walk us through it," the controller said. "Shot geometry," she said. 3 constraints simultaneously. Elevation band for the required angle. Concealment from the drone flight paths. Stable firing surface given the terrain composition. Only one position satisfied all 3. I observed that position and waited for micro movement. Silence. How long to work out the geometry? The controller asked. 3 minutes, approximately, during the assault prep phase. Before the assault started. Yes. The controller looked at his notes, looked at Rowan, wrote something down. Right. Captain Weller was watching her from across the table with an expression she recognized. Not the sizing up look, and not the dismissive look, and not the recalibrating look. The one that came after all of those. The one that was trying to understand what category to put her in and finding that none of the available categories fit. She looked back at him without any particular expression. He looked away first. Wham! Kane stopped her outside the operations building. He didn't say anything for a moment. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and he looked at the mountains in the distance, which the late afternoon light had turned from gray to something closer to amber. You were in a classified program, he said. It wasn't a question. She waited. I've seen people come out of those programs before, he said. Some of them come out changed in ways that are functional. Some don't. He paused. You're the former. Is there something you need, Master Sergeant? He turned and looked at her, those pale eyes unhurried. Not right now, but I want to know something. What? The 6 operators, 11 months ago. The engagement in the valley. He watched her face. Were you there? The world went very quiet around the edges. She kept her expression still. It was not the hardest thing she had ever done, but it was in the category. I don't know what you're referring to, she said. Kane nodded slowly. Not like he believed her, like he'd expected exactly that answer, and it had told him something anyway. All right, he said. He put his hands in his pockets again and looked at the mountains. Dismissed, specialist. She walked away. She did not look back. Behind her, she heard him stay exactly where he was. That night, alone in Barracks C with the rest of the unit at the mess or the common room, Rowan sat on the edge of her bunk and held her phone and stared at the wall. The wall had a crack in the plaster that ran from the window frame to a point about 2/3 of the way to the ceiling, where it split into 2 thinner lines that went in slightly different directions. She had been looking at it for 4 days without consciously registering it. Now she registered it. She thought about the 6 operators. She thought about their names, which she had never been supposed to know, but had learned anyway because she learned everything, because not knowing was a vulnerability, and she had been conditioned since the beginning of her time in Shadow Division to treat every vulnerability as unacceptable risk. Their names had been Torres, Majewski, Ogden, Reyes, Brightwell, and Chen. 6 people, gone in 11 minutes. She had transmitted their coordinates to her handler at headquarters with 40 seconds notice before the engagement began. Standard protocol, final position confirmation, authentication codes, the routine that she had performed on every operation without deviation. The handler had confirmed receipt and told her to hold position. She had held position. The shooting had started. The shooting had ended. She had filed her debrief report. She had said nothing about the timing, because she hadn't understood the timing. Not then. She had told herself it was coincidence, enemy surveillance, a sensor network, bad luck. She had been very thorough in telling herself that. It was only afterward, in the weeks of accumulated silence that followed, that she had begun to run the timeline in her head with the same geometric logic she applied to everything else. And the geometry had not produced a conclusion she was prepared to accept. So she had not accepted it. And then she had been transferred to Fort Blackstone. And Kane had said, "The 6 operators. Were you there?" She put the phone down on the mattress. The crack in the plaster went in 2 different directions from a single point. She knew exactly how that felt. Three days after Iron Veil, she returned to her bunk after the evening run to find something on her pillow. A folded piece of paper. No envelope, no name on the outside. She looked at it for a moment without touching it. Then she took a pen from her pocket and used it to flip the paper open without putting her fingers on it. 3 words. We need to talk. Below the words, a grid coordinate. She recognized the format immediately. Not standard military grid, but a variation used by intelligence units for informal communication. The kind of format that didn't appear in any field manual. The kind of format she'd been trained to use in Shadow Division. She committed the coordinates to memory. She picked up the paper with 2 fingers, walked to the latrine, and burned it over the sink drain. The coordinate put her at the east maintenance shed, past the vehicle bay, where a broken floodlight had been creating a dead zone in the security camera coverage for what the posted work order said was pending repair, and what Rowan assessed was a deliberate and sustained gap in observation. She arrived 11 minutes early. She did not go inside. She circled the building once, checked the approaches from 3 angles, confirmed the camera blind spot, noted 2 exits, and established where she would go if the meeting went wrong. She did this automatically, the way other people check their pockets for their keys. Then she stood in the shadow of the wall and waited. Kane arrived at exactly the designated time. He came alone, from the direction of the vehicle bay, walking with the unhurried pace of a man who had nothing to explain to anyone about where he was going. He saw her immediately. She was in shadow, but he knew where to look, which told her something. And he came directly to her without scanning the area the way an amateur would have. He stood about 4 feet away and put his back against the wall beside her, not facing her, watching the same darkness she was watching. "You burned the paper," he said. "Obviously. Did anyone see you receive it?" "No?" "Good." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to tell you something. You're going to want to deny it. Don't. It wastes time we don't have." She said nothing. 11 months ago, Kane said, 6 operators from a joint task force were killed in a valley engagement outside a classified area of operation. The official finding was an enemy ambush facilitated by compromised local intelligence. The case is closed. The families were given the standard notification package and a flag each. He paused. "The official finding is wrong." The maintenance shed's sheet metal wall was cold against her shoulder. She could hear the distant sound of generators from the motor pool. "I know," she said. Kane turned his head and looked at her. It was the first time she'd seen anything like surprise move through his face, and it was brief. He absorbed it and moved past it the way experienced people absorb unexpected information. "What do you know?" "I know the finding is wrong. I know the timeline doesn't work. And I know that the coordinates for their position were transmitted to headquarters 40 seconds before the engagement began." She kept looking at the darkness ahead of her. "I transmitted them." Silence. Not the silence of shock. The silence of a man processing something he had suspected but needed to hear stated plainly. "You didn't know," he said. "No. But you figured it out." Eventually, not fast enough to matter. Kane looked away again. He breathed through his nose, slow and deliberate. "When did you figure it out?" 3 weeks after the incident. I ran the timeline with what I knew about the enemy's sensor capabilities in that area and the speed of their response. The response was too fast. The engagement began before their ground element could have been in position from any point where they could have detected the operators independently. She kept her voice level. She'd had a long time to practice saying this without her voice doing anything she didn't want it to do. "The only way the timeline works is if the enemy already had the coordinates when my transmission went out. Which means whoever received your transmission passed it to them." "Yes." Another silence, longer. "Who was your handler?" Kane asked. She had known this question was coming since he'd said we need to talk. She had been deciding how to answer it for 11 months. "A senior intelligence officer," she said. "Operating under a classification level I wasn't given the full designation for. I knew him by a call sign." She paused. "Meridian." The generators hummed. Somewhere across the installation, a door closed. Kane's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "You know his real name." "I can find it." "I already have it." He reached into his jacket and produced a folded document. Not paper, a photograph printed on standard letter stock. The kind you print from an office printer when you don't want a record of the request in the system. He held it out. "Is this the man you reported to?" She took it, looked at it in the ambient light from the distant motor pool lamps. The photograph showed a man in his mid-50s, gray at the temples, with the kind of unremarkable face that was its own form of camouflage, the face that looked like 100 other faces, that you'd look at and then look past. He was in civilian clothes, outside what appeared to be a government building, caught in a candid shot that he clearly hadn't known was being taken. She recognized him, not from having seen his face before, from having heard his voice on secured radio nets for 3 years, from having received his authentication codes, from having filed her reports to a dead drop location that he had set up and maintained and that she now understood had served a purpose beyond what she'd been told. "Yes," she said. "His name is Gareth Stoll," Kane said. "He's a senior deputy director in the intelligence coordination office attached to this command. He has operational oversight authority over 6 classified programs." He took the photograph back and folded it and put it in his jacket. One of those programs was called Shadow Division. The cold came in off the mountains and moved through the maintenance yard, and Rowan felt it and cataloged it and set it aside. "How long have you known about Shadow Division?" she asked. "Long enough. Not as long as I should have." He pushed off the wall and faced her. For the first time since the conversation started, he looked at her directly and let the full weight of what he was saying land in the space between them. "Hale, Shadow Division wasn't a counterterrorism program." She waited. The official designation was counterterrorism. The actual function, he stopped, started again. The 6 operators who died. They weren't the first. There were others before them. I have names. People who were transferred, reassigned, or died in ways that were ruled accidental or combat-related, who had one thing in common. They had all uncovered or were about to uncover financial fraud in procurement contracts associated with a set of defense programs that Stoll's office controlled. The generators continued their hum. The cold continued its movement. Rowan thought about 19 missions, 19 files, national threat, imminent danger, authorized termination. She thought about the clean, simple certainty with which she had accepted those designations and acted on them, the way she'd been trained not to question, to trust the authorization codes, to understand that her job was execution and not evaluation. She thought about what the word execution actually meant. "The targets I was given," she said. "I don't know all of them," Kane said quietly, "but some of them, yes. People who got too close to things Stoll needed kept quiet." She stood with that for a moment. It was not the first time she had allowed herself to consider it, but considering something alone in the dark of a barracks bunk and having it confirmed by another human being in the physical world were 2 very different experiences, and she found that the second one hit differently than she had anticipated. She made herself breathe, made herself stay in the physical space, the cold maintenance yard, the smell of machine oil and wet concrete, Kane's face in the dim light. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because you're the only person I know of who was inside the program and came out with a functioning conscience." He said it plainly, without sentimentality. "And because I've been building a case for 14 months, and what I have is good, but it has a gap. The gap is an operational witness, someone who can testify to the program's actual function from the inside." He looked at her steadily. "That's you. A witness who participated in the operations isn't an asset. She's a liability. In some venues, not in all of them." "What venues are you talking about?" He reached into his jacket again, and this time produced a folded card, not a photograph. A contact designation, the kind used for secure channel communication with investigative bodies that operated outside the standard command hierarchy. She had seen this format once before, in a briefing she hadn't been supposed to attend. Military criminal investigation. Not the standard branch. The specialized division that handled complex intelligence-adjacent fraud cases, the one with subpoena authority and cross-agency reach. She looked at the card. "You've been in contact with them for 8 months. I have documentary evidence, financial records, procurement irregularities, a communications intercept from 2 years ago that I obtained through channels I'd rather not explain in detail. It points to Stoll. It suggests the program. But it doesn't confirm the operational use of sanctioned killings to suppress exposure." He paused. "I need someone who was there." She handed the card back. "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime, you're a newly arrived specialist who shot well on the range and did good work in Iron Vale and hasn't given anyone a reason to look at her twice." He pocketed the card. "I'd like to keep it that way." "Does Stoll know I'm here?" "I don't know. The transfer was processed through standard channels. Whether he's monitoring those channels for your name," he left it unfinished. "It's a possibility you should carry." She thought about the bus from the depot, the 4-hour drive, the fog around Fort Blackstone. "If he does know," she said, "then being here isn't a coincidence." "No, it isn't." She looked at him. "Was the transfer you're doing?" A pause. Brief, but present. "Partially," Kane said. She absorbed that. turned it over. A man who had been building a case for 14 months, who needed an operational witness, who had identified her and arranged her transfer to a position where he could make contact. It was exactly what she would have done. "You ran an operation to recruit me," she said. "I ran an operation to find you," he said. "Whether you choose to be recruited is your decision." She looked at the mountains beyond the fence line, invisible in the dark but present in the air, in the pressure of the elevation, in the smell of the wind. "I need time," she said. "You have time. Not unlimited time, but some." He started moving toward the vehicle bay. "Don't change your patterns. Run your route. Shoot your drills. Behave exactly as you've been behaving. If Stoll is watching, anomalous behavior is the first signal. I know how surveillance works. I know you do." He paused at the corner of the building. "One more thing." She waited. "What I told you tonight, the evidence I have, the contact I've made, if any of it reaches Stoll before I'm ready to move, it doesn't just end the investigation. It ends us." He said it the way you say something you've thought about for a long time and have made your peace with. "I need you to understand what you're holding." "I understand." He looked at her for another moment. Then he went around the corner and was gone, his footsteps absorbed by the concrete and the generator noise and the dark. Rowan stood in the maintenance yard alone for 90 seconds. Then she walked back toward the barracks by a different route than she'd come, because she always used a different route back. And she spent the entire walk cataloging everything Kane had said against everything she already knew and building a map of the gap between the two. The map was not reassuring. She didn't sleep. She lay in the dark with her eyes open and ran the arithmetic of what she'd been told and what she'd known, and what the combined shape of the two things implied about the preceding 3 years of her life. At 4:30, she got up and ran her route. The ridge was darker than usual. Overcast had come in overnight, and the stars were gone, just a lightless sky pressing down on the mountain. She ran with a headlamp on the switchback portions and turned it off at the top, where the terrain was open enough that she could move by feel and the residual glow of the installation below. At the summit of the first ridge, she stopped, stood in the dark and the wind, looked at nothing in particular, 19 missions. She had filed 19 mission reports. Each one had been accepted, acknowledged, and filed away in whatever system Shadow Division used to manage its record-keeping. Each report had included confirmation of target neutralization. Each neutralization had been assessed as authorized under the program's operational mandate. She stood in the wind and let herself, for the first time without immediately shutting it down, think about what it meant that the mandate had been a construction, that the authorizations had been instruments, that the files with their clean official language, national threat, imminent danger, had been written by the same man who received the coordinates she transmitted on a cold night 11 months ago and passed them to people whose job was not counterterrorism. She thought about a word she had never applied to herself because she had been very careful not to. She thought about it now. Then she turned and ran back down the mountain because standing still in the dark solving problems that had no clean solution was a luxury she couldn't afford, and moving was the one thing she had always been able to control. Cross caught her in the bottom of the switchback, which meant he'd been tracking her route and had timed his own run accordingly, which she noted and filed away. He fell into step beside her on the service road without saying anything for the first quarter kilometer. His breathing was elevated but controlled. He'd pushed the pace on his own route, which told her the timing had been deliberate. "You didn't sleep," he said finally. "I slept enough." "No, you didn't." He glanced at her sideways. "I've been in the bunk across from yours for 3 weeks. You sleep quiet, you wake up clean. Last night the bunk didn't move after 2200 and you were up before your alarm." She ran without answering. "Something happened yesterday," he said. It wasn't accusing, just noting the way he did. "After the debrief, Kane stopped you outside. That's not unusual. He doesn't usually stay in one place for that long afterward." She had been right about him being good at reading situations. The problem with people who are good at reading situations is that eventually they read the right one. "He had questions about my technical assessment during the exercise," she said. "Okay." That's the answer. "Okay," he said again. And then, after a pause, "You know I'm not going to push it." "I know. But I want you to know that if something is—" He stopped, chose words more carefully. If something is moving that's going to affect the unit, I'd want to know. That's all. She thought about what Kane had said. Behave exactly as you've been behaving. She thought about the 19 mission files. She thought about 6 operators whose families had been told a story that wasn't true. Nothing is moving that affects the unit, she said, which was technically accurate as of that moment and would become increasingly false as time passed, but was the answer she had. They ran the last kilometer in silence and parted at the gate without another word. The next 2 weeks ran a kind of double life that she was better equipped to manage than most people would have been, because she had been living double lives as a professional requirement for 3 years and had developed the mental architecture for it. On the surface, Specialist Hale, fire support element, unremarkable except for her skill set, becoming incrementally more integrated into the unit's daily rhythms. She ate in the mess, attended briefings, ran maintenance on her equipment, shot drills on the secondary range when the primary was occupied. She began, slowly and deliberately, to become the kind of presence in the unit that didn't generate attention, not invisible, because invisible generated its own kind of attention, but calibrated to the background. Cross remained her primary spotter, and they worked together on the secondary range 3 times a week. He was improving, not at her level, not in the same category, but genuinely, measurably better, and he was applying the geometry analysis to his positioning decisions in a way that showed he'd actually absorbed the methodology rather than just noting it. She gave him feedback when he asked. She did not volunteer it, because volunteering critique to someone who hadn't invited it was an interpersonal calculation she'd never learned to make gracefully, and she was self-aware enough to know it. He asked, so she gave it. Your breathing cycle is 3 beats too long on the reset, she told him one afternoon. They were prone side by side at the 900-meter line, working a precision engagement sequence that involved 4 targets at different ranges and angles. I know. I can't feel where to cut it. It's after the second full exhale. You're going to a third before you settle. You don't need the third. How do you know I don't need the third? Because your first exhale empties about 70%, and your second gets most of the remainder. The third is just anxiety looking for something to do. He was quiet, shot, reset, shot again, came up short on the second target by 1.5 inches. That one, she said. Yeah, I felt it. He worked the bolt. Okay, shorter cycle, going again. He shot, landed center. There it is, she said. He turned his head and looked at her. You ever train anyone before? No. You should. She went back to her own scope. That's not what I do. What do you do? Currently, whatever the unit needs. And before? She looked through her scope at the target at 900 meters, a small orange circle against a gray berm, 3/4 of a kilometer away, completely still in the windless afternoon. Before I was what someone needed me to be, she said, and left it at that. Kane called her into his office 11 days after the maintenance yard meeting. Official reason? Equipment status review for the upcoming winter exercise cycle. The kind of meeting that happened routinely, required no explanation, and generated no curiosity. The office was small and utilitarian. A desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet, a whiteboard with an exercise schedule on it. The window looked out over the motor pool the same as always. He closed the door and sat behind the desk and did not offer her the chair. Stoll is coming to Fort Blackstone, he said. Inspection tour, 4 days from now. Rowan stood. It's a routine command inspection, Kane continued. He does them twice a year for installations that fall under his office's oversight authority. Fort Blackstone is on the list because of the classified programs conducted here over the past 2 years. He paused. One of those programs was a preliminary phase of Shadow Division's operational infrastructure. He'll have access to personnel records. Yes. He'll see my transfer. Yes. Will he come looking for me? Kane turned a pen over in his hand once. Set it down. I don't know. Depends on whether your name has been flagged in his monitoring system. If he transferred you here deliberately, he may come looking to assess your status. If the transfer was coincidental and he hasn't noticed you yet, the inspection tour may be when he does. She thought about the bus, the fog, Fort Blackstone appearing out of the gray like something inevitable. What do you need me to do? What you've been doing? Nothing more. He looked at her. But I need to know something first. What? The recordings. He said it flat, watching her face. Shadow Division used secure audio logging on all handler operative communications. Standard for programs of that classification. Theoretical purpose is oversight accountability. Practical effect is that every communication between you and your handler was logged to an archive. She had known this, she had known it, and she had been waiting to see if Kane knew it. The archive is stored in the program's classified infrastructure, he said, which Stoll controls, which means if there's audio evidence of the operation orders he gave you, including the night of the coordinates transmission, it exists in a system he has the authority to delete. He hasn't deleted it yet. How do you know? Because he doesn't know I've made contact with anyone who knows what to look for, she said. If he was aware of exposure risk, the archive would already be gone. He's kept it because it's leverage. The recordings implicate the operatives as much as the handlers, and if anyone ever came forward, he could use the archive to demonstrate their active participation. She held Kane's gaze. He built the program so that everyone inside it was equally compromised. Nobody could talk without incriminating themselves. Kane looked at her for a long moment. You've thought this through. For 11 months. He nodded slowly. Can you access the archive? She had thought about this too. For 11 months, alongside everything else. I have the authentication credentials I was issued at the time of my last active assignment. They may still work. Programs of this classification don't always deactivate credentials promptly after an operative transfers out. The administrative machinery is slow, and the security assumption is that transferred operatives don't retain their access motivations. Or it's deliberate, Kane said, keeping your credentials active in case he needs leverage over you specifically. That's possible too. If you access the archive and he detects it, then he knows I'm looking. She didn't wait for him to finish. I understand the risk. I'm not sure you do. Not entirely. He stood up and went to the window and looked at the motor pool. A soldier was doing something to the underside of a vehicle, legs sticking out, the clang of a socket wrench drifting up intermittently. If Stoll determines you're an active threat to him, he won't send paperwork. He'll send the same kind of asset he sent after Torres and Majewski and the others. She did not ask how he knew those names. She was past being surprised by what Kane knew. I'm aware, she said, and you're still willing to proceed. She thought about 6 sets of parents who had received a flag and a lie. She thought about the files she'd been given. National threat. Imminent danger. She thought about the voice on the secure net. Calm, professional, always calibrated, that had sent her to 19 targets and told her each time that the cause was just. I was willing before you told me about the inspection tour, she said. The timeline just changed. He turned from the window, looked at her with the pale eyes that cataloged everything. 4 days. I need 2. For what? To confirm whether my credentials are still active without triggering a full access log. There's a passive query method I can use, a diagnostic ping that registers as a system check rather than an authentication attempt. If the credentials work, I'll know without opening a trail. Kane was quiet. After that, she said, I'll need approximately 6 hours in a location with secure network access to pull what we need from the archive. Not all of it. Targeted extraction. The communications from the 6 months leading up to the Valley incident, specifically any transmissions that include authorization language for the operations I ran in that period. We have a secure terminal in the classified workroom. Access is logged, but the log is managed internally. He paused. I can clear the log, but only once, and only if I know exactly when you're going in. Then we need to coordinate timing. Yes. He came back to the desk. One thing I want you to think about. She waited. If we pull those recordings and they go to the investigative contact, it becomes a formal process, legal, evidentiary, documented. Stoll will be informed of the investigation when they're ready to move against him. Until that point, he will not know. He looked at her. But between the moment we pull the recordings and the moment they move, there's a window. In that window, if anything alerts him, he comes for us. Yes. How long is that window typically? The investigation contact told me 8 to 12 weeks from submission of primary evidence to formal action. 8 to 12 weeks was a long time. She had spent 3 years operating in windows that were measured in seconds, and she understood viscerally what a 12-week exposure period meant in terms of sustained risk management. "All right," she said. "You don't want time to think about it? I've had 11 months." She picked up the equipment review form from his desk, the official pretext for the meeting, and looked at it without reading it. "The passive query tonight. I'll have the credential status for you tomorrow morning." She set the form back down. Kane watched her cross the room to the door. "Hale." She stopped with her hand on the handle. "They weren't your fault," he said. "The 6. Whatever you've been carrying about that, the geometry of it, the timeline, you didn't know. That's not absolution for either of us, and I'm not offering it as one. But you need to be clear-eyed about what you did and what was done to you, because conflating the two is going to cloud your judgment when we can't afford clouded judgment." She stood at the door. "I'm clear-eyed," she said. She went out. She was not entirely sure it was true, but it was the answer that would get them through the next 4 days. So it was the answer she gave. She ran the passive query from her personal device at 2300, sitting in the latrine with the door locked and the water running, using a technique she had learned in Shadow Division for testing system access without generating a full authentication record. It involved a specific sequence of handshake protocols that the system interpreted as a maintenance diagnostic rather than a login attempt, the kind of query that ran automatically in the background of the program's infrastructure dozens of times a day. The response came back in 14 seconds. Her credentials were active. She sat on the edge of the sink with the device in her hands and looked at the confirmation code on the screen. The water ran. Someone came into the latrine from the barracks side, used the facilities, left. Rowan sat still. He'd kept her credentials active, which meant Kane had been right. The archive was there, the leverage was preserved, and Stoll had been watching the access logs for any sign that she'd tried to use it, and he'd been watching for 11 months, and she hadn't tried. And so he'd concluded that she either didn't know the archive existed or didn't have the spine to go near it. One of those conclusions was wrong. She closed the application, cleared the device's temporary memory, went back to her bunk. At 0540, Cross was at the gate when she returned from her run. He had coffee, 2 cups, from the mess, not the common room machine, and he held one out when she came through the gate without making it into anything more than it was. She took it. They stood at the gate for a moment. The mountains were emerging from the pre-dawn dark, taking shape against a sky that was shifting from black to the particular dark blue that came just before the first gray of sunrise. "Kane looked like he was working through something yesterday," Cross said. He drank his coffee. "More than usual. He has a lot to work through." "The inspection tour, you think?" She looked at the mountains. "Probably." "You know who's coming?" She drank. The coffee was bitter and too hot and considerably better than the common room machine. "Senior inspector from the Intelligence Coordination Office." "Heard it's a deputy director. That's a heavy visit for a routine inspection. Deputy directors have inspection authorities. It's within their remit." "Sure." He was quiet for a moment. "Rowan." He'd used her first name exactly once before, during a stretch of particularly bad weather in Iron Vale, when the rout had washed out and everyone was wet and miserable, and the professional distance had briefly dissolved into the simpler category of 2 people trying not to fall down a mountain in the rain. She registered it. "Something about this visit is bothering you," he said, "and it's not the administrative routine of it." She looked at him. He was watching the mountains too, not her, which was either courtesy or strategy, and probably both. "Cross," she said. "Yeah. Trust me when I tell you that the less you know about my concerns right now, the better for you." He considered that for a long time, long enough that the mountains took on another shade of blue above them, and the first bird of the morning started somewhere in the tree line beyond the fence. "Okay," he said finally. She handed the empty cup back to him, went inside. He stood at the gate with both cups and watched the sky change color and didn't follow. The night before the inspection tour, Rowan was in the classified workroom at 0145 in the 4-hour window that Kane had arranged and logged out of the monitoring record. The terminal was old, government procurement, 3 years behind the commercial curve, running software that she recognized from her time inside the program. She worked through the authentication sequence with the careful patience of someone who understood that speed was the enemy of accuracy in systems like this. and she logged in on the third attempt when the second failed on a credential variant she'd been uncertain about. The archive loaded. It was larger than she'd anticipated. 3 years of communications, filed by date and operation code, organized with the bureaucratic thoroughness of a system that had been built to document everything and had done its job. She didn't have time for all of it. She pulled the targeted date range 6 months prior to the Valley incident, filtered for communications that included her operative designation and a specific set of authorization code prefixes she'd memorized because you memorized everything in a program where the only thing you had was what you kept in your head, 47 files. She couldn't pull all 47 without the extraction taking longer than she had. She needed the critical ones, the authorization communications for the operations in that period, and specifically the transmissions from the night of the incident. She found the incident file, opened it. The audio was still there. She put on the headphones that Kane had left with the terminal, and she listened to her own voice from 11 months ago, calm and professional and completely unknowing, reading out grid coordinates in the precise format she'd been trained to use. And then she listened to the voice she had heard for 3 years on the other end of the secure net, the voice that belonged to the face in Kane's photograph, the voice she had trusted because trust was what the program required of her, saying copy, position confirmed, maintain observation, and await further. And then 12 seconds later, before she had adjusted her scope or moved her hand or done anything at all, before any enemy surveillance system in that valley could have processed the transmission and vectored a ground element to the coordinates, the sound of the first shot. 12 seconds. She pulled the headphones off, sat in the institutional light of the classified workroom with her hands flat on the desk. Then she copied the file she needed to the secure transfer drive Kane had provided, wiped her session, logged out, and turned off the terminal. She had what she needed. She sat in the dark for a moment longer than was necessary. 12 seconds. They had been waiting. They had been in position before she ever transmitted, which meant the coordinates she'd sent had been for confirmation, not direction. They'd already known where the operators would be, and her transmission had simply been the final signal, the green light, the authorized go. She was not the person who had sent those operators into the valley. She was the person who had told the killers it was time. She picked up the transfer drive. Outside, the inspection vehicle convoy was arriving early. She could hear the engine sounds through the building's exterior wall. The diesel note of military vehicles, the brief squelch of a radio, the sound of tires on the access road. Gareth Stoll was 12 hours ahead of schedule. She looked at the drive in her hand. She had 4 minutes to be out of this room and back in her bunk before the early arrival changed every calculation she and Kane had made. She moved. She made it back to her bunk with 90 seconds to spare. She heard the convoy through the barracks wall. 3 vehicles, maybe 4. The particular engine note of armored transport rather than standard staff cars, which told her Stoll had come with a security detail that was larger than a routine inspection warranted. She lay in her bunk with the transfer drive pressed flat under her thigh, and her breathing controlled and her eyes fixed on the ceiling crack that split into 2 directions from a single point. And she listened to the vehicle noise until it ceased at the administrative building on the far side of the installation. 90 seconds. She had cut it close enough that the margin was almost meaningless, and she knew it. And she lay there for a long time after the engine stopped and thought about what close margins actually cost when they didn't go in your favor. The drive went into the false bottom of her kit bag before first light, nested inside a waterproofed pouch with her spare batteries and a field notebook, items that the casual inspection of a bag would pass over without interest. She had manufactured the false bottom herself, 3 days ago, from materials available in the maintenance shed, because if Stoll had come early, then the inspection of personnel quarters was not an abstract possibility, and she needed to treat it as a planning certainty. She was up and in the common room when the rest of the barracks started moving at 0500. She drank coffee. She read through a technical manual she had no operational need for, because it was the kind of thing a specialist did when she had spare time, and she wanted to be doing exactly the kind of thing a specialist did when she had spare time. Cross appeared in this doorway at 0520, registered her presence with the quick visual check he did every morning that she had come to recognize as automatic rather than deliberate, and went to the coffee maker. He poured a cup, came and sat at the table not directly across from her but 2 seats to the left, which left them both with peripheral rather than direct sight lines to each other. which was the seating choice of someone who had learned that direct sight lines during morning coffee communicated a desire for conversation. He didn't want conversation. That was fine. She didn't either. At 05:45, Kane's voice came over the building intercom, which he only used when the standard company channel wasn't appropriate, which had happened exactly once since she'd arrived, for an administrative announcement about a change in mess scheduling. All personnel, formation at 0600, administration building forecourt, Class B uniform, no exceptions. Cross looked up from his coffee. Rowan did not look up from her manual. That's not normal, he said. No. Early inspection formation. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. The convoy arrived early. I heard it. Did you? He stopped. Reconsidered whatever he'd been about to say. Drank his coffee instead. She closed the manual. I'm going to get changed. Yeah. He stood as well. Rowan. She paused. Whatever is moving, he said quietly, without looking at her, I want you to know that if you need a second person in the room when it moves, I'm available. He picked up his cup and rinsed it in the sink. Just noting that. You don't have to respond. She didn't. Gareth Stoll was smaller in person than in the photograph. That was the first thing she registered when the formation assembled and the inspection party emerged from the administration building at 06:15. It wasn't an uncommon phenomenon. Photographs flattened the spatial information that told your brain how to scale a person, and many people who carried significant authority in their fields turned out to have frames that didn't match the weight of their position. Stoll was maybe 5'9", compact, the gray at his temples more prominent in person than in the candid photo Kane had shown her. He moved with the practiced economy of a man who had been in rooms where presence mattered and had learned to project it without theatrical effort. He walked the formation with 2 aides and a uniformed officer she didn't recognize. Colonel's insignia, staff officer bearing, the look of someone who had driven Stoll to enough of these inspections to have developed a managed boredom with the ritual. Stoll worked the line the way people work lines when they're not actually looking at the individuals. When the formation is a prop for the inspection authority rather than its substance. He said things to soldiers that were pleasant and professionally calibrated and immediately forgettable. He smiled with the practiced warmth of someone who had attended the right seminars. He reached Rowan's position in the formation. He did the same thing to her that he had done to everyone else. The glance, the slight pause that mimicked genuine interest, the professionally warm nothing. Then he moved on. Rowan breathed, but as he moved to the next soldier, she caught the moment. Brief, barely visible, the kind of micro-information she had trained herself to read. When his gaze came back to her, not his face, his eyes, a fraction of a second return, the involuntary kind that happened when your brain processed something on a delay and sent the body back to look again before the conscious mind could intervene. He recognized her, or recognized her name from a file, which amounted to the same thing. She did not change her expression, her posture, or her breathing. She looked at the middle distance the way everyone in a formation looks at the middle distance, and she waited for the inspection to end, and she filed the micro-return look in the part of her mind where she kept information that was going to matter very soon. Kane pulled her aside 40 minutes after the formation broke. Not to his office, to the supply room adjacent to the armory, which had no camera coverage because the camera in the corridor outside it had been pointing at a ceiling tile for the past 6 days. She noted this and noted that he had arranged it before the inspection party had arrived, which meant he had been thinking about the supply room as a meeting point for longer than the convoy's early arrival had given him. He closed the door. The supply room smelled of solvent and equipment plastic and the particular institutional smell of military storage. He recognized you, Kane said. Yes. How certain are you? Certain enough. Kane put both hands flat on the shelf behind him and looked at the middle space between them. He was doing the same arithmetic she was doing, running the same implications forward in time. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the stillness of his hands. The drive, he said. Safe. Bunk, false bottom. We need to move it faster than I planned. He looked at her. My contact at the investigative division. I need to transmit the evidence before Stoll has time to assess his exposure and decide what to do about it. If you transmit now, you compress the window between submission and formal action. I know. That window is already 8 to 12 weeks. If he moves against us during that period, I know. He said it with the flatness of someone who has already walked to the end of a bad road in their mind and come back to report on what's there. But the alternative is waiting until he determines we're a threat and acts first. I'd rather control the timing. How do you transmit without him detecting it? Encrypted channel through the investigative division's secure node. I have the access protocol. The transmission itself is undetectable on the standard military network. It routes through a civilian infrastructure overlay that the program doesn't monitor. He paused. I need the drive. She thought about the drive under her bunk. She thought about 12 seconds. She reached into the inner pocket of her jacket and produced it. He looked at her. You were carrying it. The bunk was the obvious place. First place someone looks if they're looking. He took the drive. I'm going to need 4 hours and the secure terminal. He'll be on the installation for 48 hours. He's going to request access to classified spaces. The workroom will be in his inspection itinerary. I know. I need to move before he gets to it. He put the drive in his breast pocket. Tonight, 2200. And if someone notices you're in the workroom, I'm the senior NCO of this element. I have legitimate access reasons any night of the week. He said it with a composure that she recognized as the product of having thought about this moment for a long time. What I need from you is to keep your patterns exactly normal. Nothing that draws attention. If Stoll or his aides ask you any questions, I answer within the scope of my transfer documentation and nothing outside it. Yes. And if he requests an interview with me specifically, Kane held her gaze, then we have a problem that's bigger than the transmission timeline. She nodded. She put her hands in her pockets and looked at the shelf of supplies behind his shoulder. Equipment forms, sealed packets of batteries, a row of identical black equipment cases. The ordinary material of a functioning military unit. There's something else, she said. Tell me. The inspection convoy. 4 vehicles, armored. Staff detail that's larger than standard for a routine inspection. She looked at him. He didn't come to inspect the installation, Kane. He came because he knows something is moving and he wants to see it himself. Kane was quiet. He's not going to find the evidence in 48 hours, she continued, because the evidence is on that drive. But he doesn't need to find evidence to decide on a course of action. If he concludes we're a threat, and I think he already has, he'll initiate the cleanup from here. He doesn't have to go back to his office to make that call. What are you saying? I'm saying transmit tonight, and I'm saying we shouldn't assume 48 hours. He held the drive in his pocket with 2 fingers. She could see the pressure of it through the fabric. Tonight, he said. Tonight. He went out first. She waited 3 minutes, then followed. Tuch. The inspection party occupied the administration building through the afternoon, and Stoll's aides moved through the installation with clipboards and the particular energy of people who were technically performing one task while actually performing another. Rowan watched them from the periphery of her normal activities: range cleaning, equipment maintenance, the unhurried work of a soldier with a free afternoon, and she tracked their movement pattern and built a picture of what they were actually looking for. They spent 40 minutes in the personnel records room, standard for an inspection of this type, except they had a digital retrieval device that downloaded record sets rather than reviewing individual files, which was not standard and which told her they were pulling something specific to review off-site. They spent 20 minutes in the classified access log room. She noted that and set it aside. At 1600, one of the aides, young, clean-cut, the practiced invisibility of someone who had been trained to move through spaces without generating memory, stopped near the secondary range where Rowan was running a bore-cleaning drill on her rifle. He looked at her with the calibrated casualness of someone executing a task. Specialist Hale? She ran the cleaning rod through, checked the patch, started a second pass. Yes, Deputy Director Stoll would like a brief word. Nothing formal. 10 minutes. She didn't look up from the bore. I'm on equipment maintenance. It won't take long. She set the rod down, looked at the aide with the same flat attention she'd been giving everyone since the convoy arrived. When? Now, if you're available. Where? The small conference room in the administration building, third door on the right. She picked up the cleaning rod, set it aside, began reassembling the rifle in the deliberate sequence she always used, partly because it was correct, and partly because she needed 45 seconds to make sure her face was doing what she wanted it to do. Give me 5 minutes, she said. I don't leave equipment mid-maintenance. The aide nodded and went away, and she spent those 5 minutes finishing the cleaning drill with exactly the same tempo she would have used if the conversation had never happened. The small conference room had a table that seated 6 and currently held 1. Stoll was at the near end. No aide, a folder closed on the table in front of him. He indicated the chair across from him without standing. She sat. He looked at her the way she had looked at targets through a scope, with a specific and functional attention that was gathering information rather than making conversation. She recognized it because she used it herself. "Specialist Hale," he said. "How are you settling in at Fort Blackstone?" "Fine, sir." The transfer was abrupt. Unusual circumstances. "I was assigned." "Yes." He tapped the folder once with one finger, not opening it, just noting its presence, the way you note a tool that's available. "Your previous assignment was a good fit for your skills. I was told the reassignment served operational needs." "It did." He smiled. It reached about 60% of the way to his eyes. "You've been here, what, 5 weeks?" 6. 6. How's the unit?" "Functional, good people." "Master Sergeant Kane speaks well of your field performance. Iron Veil." He said it as though he'd read the debrief report, which he had no administrative reason to have access to and yet clearly did. "The exercise went well," she said. "Hidden shooter, geometry analysis." He nodded, something appreciative in the performance of it. "That's a particular skill set." "Thank you, sir." Silence. The particular kind that was designed to fill itself. She had used this silence on people before. The extended pause after a pleasantry. The expectation that the other person would move to fill it, to offer something, to give you something you could use. She sat in it without moving. He watched her sit in it, and she watched him watch her, and the silence extended to the point where it was no longer a tool and had become a statement. Then he said, "You knew the program well." She didn't respond. "Shadow Division was good work," he said. "Difficult, necessary work. The people who did it were selected because they were exceptional. You were exceptional." He met her eyes. "Past tense is unfortunate, but these programs have life cycles." "I understand." "Do you?" He tilted his head slightly, not threateningly, more like genuine inquiry, the kind that was actually something else wearing inquiry's clothes. "The work you did, the targets you were given, they served a larger purpose that you may not have had full visibility into. That's the nature of compartmentalized operations. The people at any single level see their piece. The architecture only resolves from a higher vantage point." She said nothing. "I want to make sure you understand that what you were asked to do was authorized, legitimate. Whatever concerns you might have about specifics," he paused with the precision of someone who had selected that word with care. "Those concerns exist because you don't have the full picture. You have your piece." She looked at him across the small table. She thought about 12 seconds. She thought about a voice on a secure net saying, "Copy, position confirmed." "I don't have any concerns, sir," she said. The 60% smile returned. "Good. That's what I hoped to hear." He stood, picked up the folder. "Enjoy your posting, Specialist. Fort Blackstone is a good installation. Solid people." She stood when he stood. "One thing," he said at the door. She waited. "Master Sergeant Kane." He said it with the same pleasant calibration he applied to everything. "Good NCO. Sometimes carries things longer than is useful. If he ever shares concerns with you about programs or operations or administrative matters that aren't in his direct purview," he opened the door. "That's the kind of thing that's worth flagging up the chain. For his own benefit, honestly. Good NCOs occasionally need reminding of their lane." He went out. She stood in the conference room for 10 seconds after the door closed. Then she walked to the administration building's exterior door, took the long route back to the barracks, and composed a 4-sentence summary of the conversation in her head with the accuracy she'd trained herself to produce from verbal memory. She had to get it to Kane before 1900. Mas. She found him at the motor pool doing what looked like a vehicle inspection review, surrounded by the kind of administrative plausibility he was very good at constructing. She passed near enough to say something without it looking like a directed approach. "He knows," she said without stopping. The conversation was a warning. He mentioned you specifically. He's moving faster than we thought. She kept walking. She didn't look back to see his reaction, but she heard the brief pause in what he was doing, a single beat of stillness. And then he resumed, and she was already at the far end of the motor pool, and the moment had lasted less than 10 seconds total. It was enough. The final exercise of Stoll's inspection occurred the next morning, and nobody in the unit knew it was an exercise. It presented itself as a real-world training evolution, a directive from the installation commander, routed through the operations channel designating a night exercise in the northern training area. 48-hour evolution, full mission simulation, company-sized element. Movement began at 2200. Rowan saw the exercise order at 1800 and read it twice. The northern training area. Night movement. Company-sized element pushing through terrain that, above the third ridge, had limited radio coverage and a natural acoustic buffer that would make it difficult to coordinate with the installation. She sat in the barracks and looked at the order on her phone and felt the particular cold that came not from temperature but from recognition. She had seen this architecture before. Not this specific order, not these specific coordinates, but this shape. The legitimate-looking directive, the reasonable operational rationale, the terrain selection that isolated the element from oversight. She had seen it from the other side. She had received orders of this type and understood their function only afterward. This was a cleanup operation. She looked at the order for a long time, then she went to find Kane. He wasn't in his office, he wasn't in the common room, or the mess, or the motor pool. She checked the classified workroom. Door locked, no light underneath. She went back to his office and tried the door. Unlocked. Inside on his desk, a single folded sheet of paper. She opened it. Transmission complete. 2100. K2100. An hour ago. The drive was gone from his desk. The secure terminal visible through the open inner door showed a cleared session, properly logged out. He had sent it. She stood in the office and thought about 8 to 12 weeks. She thought about a man in a small conference room with a 60% smile telling her that good NCOs occasionally need reminding of their lane. She thought about 4 armored vehicles arriving 12 hours ahead of schedule. She thought about the exercise order, 48 hours. Northern training area, company-sized element. She went back to the order on her phone and looked at the grid coordinates for the final objective position. The high ridge line at the northern end of the training area, designated as a communications relay point for the exercise. She pulled up the terrain map. The final objective position had 2 approaches. The primary approach, the one the unit would use based on the route specified in the order, came up the western face through a draw that narrowed progressively above the 2,000-meter line. The narrowing created a natural funnel. In the funnel, a single well-positioned element with overlapping fields of fire could cover the entire avenue of approach with no angle from which the assault force could effectively return fire. The secondary approach was longer, more technical, required equipment that wasn't in the unit's standard load for a training evolution, and wasn't mentioned in the route order at all. She had used positions like the one in the western draw before. She knew exactly what they were for. Her hands were steady when she put the phone in her pocket, which surprised her slightly, because what she was feeling was not steady. What she was feeling was the particular species of anger that lives on the other side of a long period of suppression, that comes out not as heat, but as something colder and more focused and considerably more useful. She went to the armory. Tit. Kane found her there at 2000, pulling her equipment with the deliberate efficiency of someone who had made a decision and was executing it. He stood in the armory doorway and looked at her and at the equipment she was pulling. Not just her primary rifle, but her suppressed sidearm, her night optics, a radio and a frequency range that wasn't in the exercise kit list. "You read the order," he said. "I read it. And you—" "It's not an exercise." He was quiet. He had come to the armory for his own equipment, she realized. He was carrying his plate carrier already, his rifle bag over his shoulder. "You read it too," she said, 2 hours ago. He came into the armory, pulled his locked bay. "I've been thinking about how to handle it. I'm going in ahead of the element, northern approach, before the unit starts its movement." He turned and looked at her. "The northern approach isn't in the order." "No. The terrain above 3,000 meters on the northern face is loose rock, technical, in the dark." "Yes. If you go in that way, I can cover the western draw from the ridgeline. Any element that has a prepared position in the draw will be exposed to the upper angle. She chambered around with the quiet authority of someone who has done it thousands of times. They won't expect an angle from above. The position geometry doesn't work from above unless someone came up the northern face. Kane watched her. The unit moves at 2200, she said. I need to be on the ridgeline by 2130. That's 90 minutes to climb 4 kilometers of technical terrain in the dark. I know. Hale. She looked at him. If there's a prepared hostile element in that draw, he said carefully, with the precision of someone stating something they need said plainly, this stops being a training exercise the moment you engage. It stopped being a training exercise when someone wrote the order. He held her gaze. The armory was small and smelled of oil and metal, and the conversation was filling it up. Cross, he said. What about him? He needs to know enough to keep the element out of the draw if you find what we think is in there. Kane pulled his radio. He's lead on the company element tonight. If he pushes the unit into that funnel before you've cleared it, then tell him. Tell him something that gets him to hold at phase line 3 without explaining everything. What do I tell him? You're a master sergeant. Tell him you received intelligence of a possible op for adjustment to the objective approach, and you want him to hold and confirm before he commits the element to the draw. She pulled the sling over her shoulder. He's good enough to do it on that alone. Kane looked at his radio, looked at her. If I'm wrong about the order, then I climb a mountain in the dark for nothing, and we're all embarrassed. She met his eyes. But you're not wrong. He wasn't. She could see it in his face, the absence of the doubt that would have been there if he were wrong. He had read the order the same way she had done the same terrain analysis, had come to the armory with his plate carrier already on because on some level he had known what the night was going to require before he'd consciously decided. Go, he said. She went. Batin. The northern face of the training area ridge was everything the terrain map had suggested. Loose shale above the tree line, technical scrambling on the upper third where the angle went above 30 degrees, and the footing required both hands and careful weight distribution and a specific kind of patience that was different from the patience of a firing position. That patience was internal. This was external and physical, and demanded her full attention to the placement of each step, to the stability of each handhold, to the assessment of what the rock would do under her weight before she committed to it. She moved without a headlamp above the tree line, ambient light from the overcast sky. Not much, but enough when your eyes had been adjusted for 40 minutes. She knew the route because she had memorized it from the terrain map with the same completeness she applied to everything, and she navigated by elevation and bearing and the feel of the terrain under her hands. She reached the ridge line at 21:22, 8 minutes ahead of her target. She found her position, a natural rock feature on the southern lip of the ridge that provided cover, a stable firing surface, and a direct line of sight down into the upper section of the western draw. She set up with the controlled urgency of someone who is trained for this, bipod extended, scope covers off, radio on the correct frequency, suppressor already threaded, body settled into the position with the muscle memory of 1,000 repetitions. She glassed the draw below. Darkness and rock and the shadows of scrub vegetation. She switched to the night optic, the thermal overlay that painted the world in temperature gradients, living things bright against the cooler ground. She found them in 40 seconds. 4. No. 5. One further back, elevated, covering the ingress point at the bottom of the draw. The other 4 in 2 pairs, in positions on either side of the funnel that created the overlapping fields she had projected from the map. They were still, which was professional, which meant they had been waiting there long enough to let their temperature signatures blend with the ambient rock, and she was picking them up on residual differential rather than active heat output. Not opt for soldiers from another unit. Their equipment loadout was wrong. Opt for training exercises carried marking round weapons and war identifiers. These 5 carried suppressed weapons with the profile of live fire configurations, and none of them had the reflective armbands that exercise players wore for safety identification. Her jaw tightened. She was right. She keyed the radio. Overwatch to actual, Kane's call sign for the night. The response was immediate. Actual, go. 5 elements in this draw. Non-exercise loadout. Confirmed. She kept her voice flat and low. Hold the unit at phase line 3. Do not enter the draw. A pause. Then, copy. Holding. She heard the underlying weight of that word, the confirmation of the thing they had both suspected and both hoped to be wrong about. She heard something else too beneath his voice, the sound of movement, close, in the dark below the ridgeline. She moved the thermal scope. A sixth. Coming up the eastern slope, below her position, angling for the ridgeline. Not approaching from below, approaching laterally, already above the 3,000-meter line, which meant he had started his movement before she had and had come from a staging position she hadn't known about. He was 40 meters out and moving with the controlled pace of someone who was going to a specific destination, her destination. She had 60 seconds before he reached her position. She processed the geometry with the cold efficiency that lived on the other side of the anger. 6 elements total. 5 in the draw positioned against the unit's approach. 1 coming to her position, which meant they had anticipated someone might come up the northern face or had detected her movement on the way up, and had placed a counter-element. She could not engage 6 simultaneously. She was one person with a suppressed rifle on a ridgeline in the dark. She could, however, change the geometry. She keyed the radio again. Cross. His voice, tight, professional. Go. Element approaching my position. Eastern slope, 40 meters. She was already moving, pulling her position silently, relocating 3 meters to the right where the rock feature created a different angle. Keep the unit at phase line 3. Do not move until I tell you. Copy. Standing by. Kane. She settled into the new position. When I fire, you're going to hear it. Don't let anyone move until the draw is clear. Understood. A beat. Hale. Yes. Come back off that ridge. She looked through the thermal scope at the 6th element, now 25 meters out, moving with the confidence of someone who expected the ridgeline to be empty. Working on it, she said. She let him come to within 15 meters, close enough to confirm his loadout, suppressed, live configuration, no exercise markings, and to confirm his destination, which was exactly where she had been set up 4 minutes ago. She waited until he stepped into the pocket of open rock that she had vacated. Then she moved, not to shoot him. To present herself at a different angle, behind him, at the edge of his peripheral vision, where the night optic he was wearing had a blind spot based on the model. She had identified the model from 30 meters by the housing profile, and she knew the blind spot because she had trained on that same system. She came around the rock and she had her sidearm at contact distance, and she said, "Down, hands where I can see them." He spun. She had already accounted for that, and she was outside the line of his spin, already had control of the weapon before he had fully processed her presence, and then she had him face down on the rock with his own weapon out of the equation and her knee in his lower back and her sidearm against the back of his head. He was still. "How many of you?" she said. Silence. She pressed the sidearm harder. "How many?" "6, he said into the rock. His voice was calm, professional. The voice of someone who had been trained not to panic in this situation, which told her exactly what category of operator she was dealing with and confirmed, comprehensively, and finally, everything she and Kane had theorized. These were not soldiers, these were contractors, the same kind of asset that Shadow Division had deployed, the same kind of asset she had once been. "The draw," she said. "4 positions?" He didn't answer. She had what she needed from his silence. She stripped his radio, zip-tied his hands with the restraints from her kit, secured him to the rock feature with his own equipment harness, and moved back to her firing position. She keyed her radio. "Overwatch to actual, northern element secured, 4 positions in the draw. They're not going to move until the unit does. They need the unit in the funnel." She settled back into position. "I need you and Cross to hold. Give me 8 minutes. Kane's voice. 8 minutes? Then what?" She looked through the thermal scope at the 4 positions below. 2 pairs, each pair covering an overlapping sector, patient and still. "Then it's done," she said. She calculated the geometry. From her position on the ridgeline, she had an angle on the draw that the 4 elements below had no way to anticipate because nobody came up the northern face. The angle was steep, nearly 40 degrees of declination, which required compensation that most shooters didn't train for because most shooters didn't operate from ridgelines in the dark with night optics in a crosswind at altitude. She trained for it. The wind at the ridge line was coming off the north face at roughly 14 kilometers per hour. The declination required a hold adjustment that she calculated without writing it down. She picked the nearest pair first, the two furthest into the draw, the ones who would have the first shot geometry on the unit's lead elements. Her first shot dropped the closer of the two. The thermal signature folded and went to ground and stayed there. She was already on the second before the first hit registered. The suppressor kept the sound signature minimal, but not absent. The second contractor heard it and started to move, and she led the movement, and the second shot connected and the movement stopped. The FAR pair had 20 seconds to identify her position and react. She was already repositioning, moving along the ridge line to a secondary feature she'd identified during setup, changing her angle. By the time they'd located where the first shots had originated, she wasn't there. She was 16 meters to the left, new angle, and she took the third from a position they hadn't accounted for. The fourth broke. Not toward the unit's approach, away from it, up the draw and over the saddle, the instinct of someone whose tactical picture had just collapsed completely. She let him go. She keyed the radio. "Draw is clear," she said. 3 down, 1 withdrew. The unit can move. Silence on the net for a moment that was probably 2 seconds and felt longer. Then cross. Copy. Moving. Then Kane, and his voice had something in it that she didn't have a clean word for. Not relief, not satisfaction, something more complicated and more human than either. "Good work, Overwatch." She lay on the ridgeline in the dark and the wind and looked at the draw below through the thermal scope, where 3 heat signatures were cooling on the rock, and she felt the after-action state arrive. The particular flatness that came after the focus released, when the body began to process what the mind had been too occupied to fully register. She had pointed her rifle at the people who had built her, not for the first time tonight, but for the first time with full knowledge of what she was doing and why, with nothing between her and the truth of the situation, no compartmentalization, no authorization codes, no national threat, imminent danger to put the action in a frame that someone else had constructed. She had made the choice herself. All of it. Above her, the overcast was beginning to thin. Through a gap in the cloud cover, a narrow strip of sky appeared, dark, full of stars that had been there the entire time, invisible until the obstruction moved. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up her rifle and began the descent. She came off the northern face in 41 minutes, which was faster than the ascent, and considerably harder on her knees. The unit was already at the objective when she reached the base of the ridge. She could hear the radio traffic on the company net, cross-running his element through the draw with the methodical efficiency of someone who trusted the clearance he'd been given and was moving before the tactical window closed. No shooting, no contact. The 3 contractors in the draw were down, and the 4th had gone over the saddle and wasn't coming back, and the unit moved through the objective without incident and established the communications relay position and called it complete at 23:14. Textbook execution. Except that nothing about the night had been a textbook exercise. Kane met her at the staging area at the base of the approach route. He was alone, standing in the dark with his radio and his rifle and the expression of a man who had been running contingency calculations for the past 90 minutes and had only just permitted himself to stop. He looked at her, looked her over. The way you check someone for damage without making it obvious that's what you're doing. "You're in one piece," he said. Mostly. I scraped my left hand on the descent." She held it up briefly. The rock had taken some skin off her palm. It was not interesting. "The contractor I secured on the ridgeline, someone needs to collect him before the unit sweeps the area." "Already sent 2 people." She looked at him. "Who?" "Delaney and Espinoza. I trust them. They don't know what they're picking up, just that I need someone brought in." He paused. "The 3 in the draw?" "They need medical assessment. I use non-lethal engagement on 2. Impact trauma. They'll need attention, but they're stable. The 3rd took a round to the upper leg." She said it the way she said everything, flatly, factually, with the affect of someone reporting information rather than defending a decision. "He needs immediate care." Kane was already on his radio. She stood in the dark and looked at the mountains and waited for the adrenaline cascade to finish what it was doing to her hands. It took about 4 minutes. She kept her hands in her jacket pockets where nobody could see them. Choked. Cross found her at 23:40, sitting on the running board of one of the unit vehicles at the staging area, drinking water from a bottle she didn't remember picking up. He came out of the dark from the direction of the draw. his rifle across his chest, his face carrying the particular expression of a man who has processed a sequence of events and arrived at a conclusion he's not sure how to categorize. He sat on the running board beside her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. 3 contractors, he said finally. Non-military, suppressed live-fire weapons, no exercise markings. He stared at the dark middle distance. In a training exercise that appeared on the ops channel with valid authentication codes. Yes, and you knew. I suspected. There's a difference? In terms of how certain I was before I climbed the mountain? Yes, there's a difference. She drank. In terms of outcome? No. He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. It was a gesture she'd seen him make twice before, both times when he was working through something that didn't have a clean resolution. The exercise order. Who wrote it? Not anyone in this unit. Then who? Cross. He stopped. There are things moving that are above the unit's level, she said. Kane has it. The investigative division has the evidence they need to move formally. Tonight changed the timeline, but not the direction. Tonight changed a lot of things. He looked at her. You went up a technical ridgeline in the dark, alone, against a 6-person element with live weapons. The geometry required it. The geometry. He said it with a flatness that wasn't quite frustration and wasn't quite admiration, and was probably both. The unit would have walked into that draw. Yes. And you, what, just knew? From the order? She thought about how to explain it. Not the full version. Not tonight, not here. The version that was true enough to be useful. I've seen that operational architecture before, she said. The terrain selection, the funnel, the isolation from oversight. I recognized it. Where did you see it? She looked at him. From inside it. He was quiet. She could see him doing the work of that, assembling it against what he already knew, what he'd been observing for 6 weeks. The range performance, and the field instinct, and the careful, constant environmental scanning, and the classified transfer and the maintenance yard meeting he'd noticed but hadn't pressed. She watched it resolve in his face. Shadow division, he said. She didn't confirm it. She also didn't deny it. He exhaled, slow, controlled. How long? 3 years. And the 6 operators. 11 months ago. She looked at the mountains. You were involved, he said. Not accusing, the tone of someone stating a fact they'd reached through careful reasoning and didn't like but weren't going to pretend wasn't there. I transmitted coordinates, she said. I didn't know what they were going to be used for. I know that's not a complete answer. No, it's not. He was quiet for a moment, but it's an honest one. She hadn't expected that. She didn't let the surprise show, but it moved through her. I'm sorry, he said. For whatever that's worth from someone who doesn't have the full picture. You don't have to eat. I know I don't. He stood, picked up his rifle, looked at her from standing height with the straightforward attention she'd come to recognize as his most genuine mode. What do you need from me for whatever comes next? She looked up at him. Do what Kane tells you. Don't ask questions that will put you in a position where someone can use your knowledge against you, and keep the unit out of the administrative building until the investigative team arrives. When does the investigative team arrive? If Kane's transmission went through last night, within 48 hours, maybe less given what happened tonight. And Stoll? Still on the installation. Cross absorbed that. So the man who sent the contractors is having breakfast in the admin building. Probably. That's a deeply uncomfortable situation. Yes. He started to move. Stopped. Hale. She waited. For what it's worth, he said, you're the best shooter I've ever worked with, and I've worked with some genuinely good ones. He said it the way he said most things, directly, without decoration. Figured you should hear it from someone who actually knows the difference. He walked away into the dark before she could respond, which she suspected was deliberate. Gareth Stoll left the installation at 0600 the following morning. Rowan watched the convoy from the mess hall window. 3 vehicles this time. 1 fewer than the arrival. She noted the absence and filed it. The 4th vehicle had contained the security detail that had staged the contractors in the training area, and that vehicle was now evidence. Kane was in the administration building when the convoy departed. He saw Stoll off with the professional courtesy appropriate to a senior NCO, sending off an inspection official, and his face during that interaction, which Rowan observed from a distance, was a masterwork of composed neutrality. She made a note of that too, not as a tactical data point, but as something closer to respect. The investigative division contact called Kane's secure device at 0842. She wasn't in the room for that call, but Kane found her afterward in the equipment room and gave her the summary in 4 sentences. The evidence transfer had been received and verified. The recordings from the archive were being assessed by the division's legal office. A formal investigation had been opened under a sealed designation, and an investigative team was inbound. When? She said. 72 hours. And Stoll? The division has flagged his travel. He doesn't know it yet. Kane set down the piece of equipment he'd been holding as a prop during the conversation. His security clearances will be suspended as part of the investigation protocol once the team is on the ground. At that point, he's formally notified. She did the math. 72 hours to formal notification. Whatever Stoll had concluded about the previous night's events, and he would have received a report from whoever was managing the contractor team, he had 72 hours to act before the window closed on him. He's going to move in that window, she said. I know. He won't send contractors again, too exposed. No. Kane looked at her. He'll use the program's administrative authority, transfer orders, security flag, potentially a detainment request through the classified channels he still has access to. He paused. For both of us. She had expected this. She had been expecting it since the maintenance yard. What do? We stay visible. On installation, documented activity, witnesses to our location at all times. He can't move administrative paperwork against us without someone processing it. And processing takes time, and time is the one thing he doesn't have. He picked the equipment back up. In 72 hours, the investigative team arrives with enough authority to make his administrative access irrelevant. And if the paperwork moves faster than 72 hours, Kane looked at her steadily, then we deal with that when it happens. It was not a satisfying answer. It was, however, an honest one, and she had developed a reliable preference for honest over satisfying. The debrief on the training exercise happened at 1400 in the main operations room, run by Captain Weller, with the installation's training officer present. It was a formal after-action review of a training exercise that had produced, by official accounting, an irregular contact event involving non-exercise personnel in the training area. The language was deliberately bland. The installation commander had been briefed at 0900 and had made the decision to keep the formal incident documentation at the lowest classification level that was technically accurate, while the investigative division's sealed inquiry ran its course. This meant the debrief used language that described what had happened without describing what it meant, which created an interesting tension in the room between what everyone was saying and what everyone was thinking. Weller ran the timeline without editorializing. He covered the exercise order, the movement sequence, the hold at phase line 3, the clearance of the draw, the objective seizure. He covered the irregular personnel contact in the terms the installation commander had specified. He did not cover who had cleared the draw or how. When the debrief reached that point in the timeline, he looked at Kane. Kane said, Fire support element conducted reconnaissance of the approach route prior to the company's movement, identified a potential hazard, neutralized it, and confirmed the route clear. Details of the reconnaissance method are under review by the appropriate authority. The training officer wrote something on his form. Captain Weller looked at Rowan for exactly 1 second, then looked at the wall behind her, then looked back at his notes. The debrief continued. Afterward, in the corridor, Weller stopped Kane and Rowan together. He looked at both of them with the expression of a man who has decided to say something direct. Off the record, he said. Kane waited. The 4 personnel collected from the training area last night. He kept his voice low, even in the empty corridor. One of them talked, not much, but enough. He wasn't military. No, Kane said. He wasn't. And the exercise order was not generated by this unit or this installation. Weller looked at Rowan. You went up the northern face. She held his gaze. Yes, sir. In the dark, before the exercise movement, without orders, with Master Sergeant Kane's knowledge. That's not the same as orders. No, sir, it isn't. He looked at her for another moment, then at Kane. Then he said something that wasn't in any regulation she'd ever read. My unit walked through that draw at 2300 in full movement order. If someone had been in position to engage, we'd have lost people. He straightened slightly. Thank you. He went back into the operations room. Kane looked at Rowan. Rowan looked at the wall. That's as much recognition as you're going to get publicly for the next several weeks, Kane said. That's fine. You sure? She thought about what recognition had cost her the last time someone decided she was useful. Very sure. The 72 hours were the longest she had spent since the nights after the Valley incident, when she had lain in the dark running timelines and trying to build a frame that would hold all the information she had without breaking. She ran her route every morning. She shot her drills. She ate in the mess and attended formations and maintained her equipment and did everything that constituted the ordinary surface of a specialist at a forward installation. And underneath all of it, she tracked time the way she tracked wind, continuously, automatically, with the knowledge that the variable was moving whether she watched it or not. On the second day, a transfer order appeared in the administrative system for Master Sergeant Victor Kane. Kane brought it to her at 0700, printed on a single sheet, administrative language clean and mundane around an operational reality that was neither. She read it. Effective 48 hours. Yes. He moved faster than we expected. His administrative access is still active. He used it. Kane set the paper on the table between them. If I'm transferred out before the investigative team arrives, I'm no longer on installation when they get here. My testimony becomes a secondary submission rather than a primary witness interview. It's not fatal to the case, but it weakens the chain of custody on the evidence. Can you contest the transfer? Through normal channels, yes. It takes time. More time than we have. He looked at her. I need to make a direct contact with the investigative team. Not the secure node. Direct contact, person to person. Request they accelerate. How do you do that without Stoll seeing the communication? I don't use military communications infrastructure. He reached into his jacket and produced a civilian device. A personal phone, not his issued device. I have a direct number for the lead investigator. Given the circumstances, I think it qualifies as appropriate use. She looked at the phone. Looked at him. Do it. He made the call from the equipment room while she stood in the doorway and watched the corridor. She heard his voice, low and precise, delivering the situation in the compressed language of someone accustomed to briefing under constraints. She heard the specific words accelerated timeline and active administrative countermeasures and witness integrity. She heard him read the transfer order designation number, then silence while he listened. Then, copy, understood, we'll be ready. He ended the call, came out of the equipment room. 24 hours, he said. They're moving the team up. She exhaled, slowly, through her nose, without making a production of it. Good. They want a witness statement from you as well, not just testimony, a formal affidavit, operational details, the archive extraction, the ridgeline. He looked at her directly. Everything. She thought about what everything meant. The 19 missions, the files with their clean official language, the things she had done inside a program that had used her authorization codes as murder weapons and dressed it as national security. Everything, she said. It won't be comfortable. I'm aware. They'll have questions about your own participation in operations that may require Kane. She looked at him. I know what I did. I know the shape of it, and I know the parts of it I can defend and the parts I can't. I'll answer every question they put to me. She paused. The only way this works is if all of it comes out, not the parts that are convenient, all of it. He looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said, tapped. The investigative team arrived at 0300 on the third day. 2 vehicles, civilian plates, 4 people who moved through the installation's visitor processing with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this before and did not find the hour unusual. Rowan was awake. She had been awake since 0100. She met them in the installation commander's conference room at 0415 with Kane present and a JAG officer the team had brought with them. The lead investigator was a woman in her mid-40s named Selby. No title offered, no rank visible, the kind of person whose authority came from the credentials she produced rather than any uniform she wore. Selby set up her recording equipment, placed a printed form on the table in front of Rowan, and looked at her with the direct attention of someone who was very good at reading people quickly. "Before we start," Selby said, "I want to be clear about what this conversation is and what it isn't. This is a formal witness interview under a sealed investigative authority. You are not a suspect in this inquiry. You are a material witness. That distinction matters, and I want you to understand it before we go further." She paused. "Do you understand?" "Yes." "Do you want legal counsel present?" Rowan looked at the JAG officer. He was young, probably one of his first complex cases, holding a yellow legal pad with the careful posture of someone who had been told to take good notes and was taking that instruction seriously. "I'll take the statement the way it sits," she said. Selby nodded. "Then let's begin." It took 4 hours. Selby asked questions with the precision of someone who had read every piece of evidence already and was using the interview to fill gaps rather than establish the basic shape of things. She didn't ask easy questions. She didn't skip the hard ones. When Rowan's answers required her to describe operational details of the mission she had run inside Shadow Division, Selby let her describe them completely, without interruption, without visible reaction. The JAG officer filled 7 pages of his legal pad. Kane sat against the wall for the first 2 hours and left at 06:30 for his own separate interview in the room across the corridor. Rowan heard the door close and felt the room get quieter without him in it, which was not something she'd expected to feel. At one point, around the 3rd hour, Selby asked, "The night of the Valley incident, when you transmitted the coordinates, what did you believe at that moment about the purpose of the transmission?" She had been asked versions of this question by herself, in the dark, for 11 months. She had a precise answer. "I believed I was providing final position confirmation for a counterterrorism interdiction operation against a designated threat," she said. "I believed the authorization I had been given was legitimate. I believed the program I was operating under was what I had been told it was." She stopped. Then, "All 3 of those beliefs were wrong. I know that now. At the time, I did not. Whether that constitutes a meaningful distinction is something I'm not the right person to assess." Selby looked at her. "That's a more honest answer than most people in your position give." "Most people in my position don't fully understand what their position actually was," Rowan said. "I do. It took me a while, but I do." Selby wrote something. "The archive recordings. You accessed them under existing credentials." "Yes." "You could have accessed them at any point during the 11 months between the Valley incident and your transfer to Fort Blackstone." "Yes." "Why didn't you?" She looked at the table, at her hands, flat on the surface. The scraped palm from the ridgeline descent was scabbing over. "Because I wasn't ready to confirm what I already suspected," she said. "And because I was afraid that if I confirmed it and had nowhere to take it, I would have to live with the full weight of it alone. And I wasn't sure I could do that." She looked up at Selby. "That's the honest answer. It's not a good one. It's a human one," Selby said. She didn't say it kindly or unkindly. She said it the way she said most things, as a factual observation. The interview ended at 08:20. Selby thanked her, told her the formal processing would take approximately 2 weeks, and that she would be contacted if additional testimony was required. The JAG officer packed his legal pad. Everyone filed out in the orderly way of people who have completed a task. Rowan stayed in the conference room for a few minutes after they left. She sat in the chair and looked at the table and felt the particular hollowness that followed the release of something that had been load-bearing inside her for a long time. Stoll's clearances were suspended at 0900. She heard about it from Cross, who heard about it from Delaney, who had overheard 2 of the investigative team members discussing logistics in the corridor. The information traveled through the unit the way information always traveled through units. Sideways and fast, through human networks that no official communication plan had designed or anticipated. By 1100, the installation was operating with the charged quiet of a space where something significant has happened, and most people don't know exactly what it was, but can feel the shape of it. Stoll's formal notification arrived via secure channel at 1300. She didn't see it. Kane told her about it that evening, in the motor pool, standing beside a vehicle with their backs to the camera coverage, the way they always had their real conversations. He didn't take it quietly, Kane said. He made contact with 2 separate senior officials attempting to intervene in the investigation. Both of those contacts are now part of the investigative record. Ifam He paused. He also submitted an emergency transfer order for you, signed by his own authority, through the program's administrative channel. He reached into his pocket and produced a single printed page. It was processed and then immediately flagged and voided by the investigative authority. Took 11 minutes. About 10. She looked at the voided transfer order. Her name at the top, a destination she didn't recognize, language about classified reassignment requirements. The void stamp across the middle was red and final. 11 minutes, she said. The team was watching his administrative access from the moment the suspension was served. Kane took the paper back. He was trying to move you before the investigation locked him out completely. She thought about the transfer order, about what happened to people who were transferred out of positions before they could testify. She thought about Torres and Majewski and the others whose names she carried. He's not going to be able to reach us, she said. It was partly a question. His access is gone. His contacts are documented. The contractors from the training area are in custody. Kane folded the paper. He's been trying to move pieces on a board that doesn't exist anymore. She looked at the mountains. The afternoon light was doing something to the rock faces on the upper ridgeline, turning the gray to something closer to amber. The same thing the late light had done on the night she and Kane had first spoken outside the operations building after Iron Veil, which felt like it had happened in a different year. The 6 operators, she said, their families. The investigation will address the official findings formally. When the case resolves, the record is corrected. He said it carefully, the way you say something true that is not the same as sufficient. I know that's not everything. No. She watched the light on the rock. But it's something they don't have right now. Beside her, Kane said nothing. He stood in the motor pool in the amber light and looked at the same mountains, and they were both quiet for a while. 2 people who had been carrying the same weight in different compartments for different amounts of time and had only recently been in the same room with it. You did good work, Kane said. He said it the way he said most things that mattered. Flat, direct, without performance. On the ridgeline, in the debrief, in the interview, all of it. She thought about what good work had meant at various points in her life. The calibration had shifted significantly. We did good work, she said. He didn't argue with the correction. He took it the way it was offered. The generators hummed. The light changed. Somewhere in the unit, a door opened and the sound of voices drifted out across the motor pool. Ordinary voices. The normal noise of people ending a day, oblivious to the machinery that had been moving around them and had now, finally, begun to resolve. She stood in it for a moment longer, felt the resolution begin its slow work on the places inside her that had been braced against impact for a very long time. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like the first day of something that was going to take a while, which was, she had come to understand, what most worthwhile things felt like at the beginning. She picked up her kit bag. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow, Kane agreed. They walked back toward the barracks in the fading light, not together exactly. A few feet of distance, 2 people moving in the same direction, and the mountains behind them held their shape in the last of the amber glow before the dark came in and covered everything. Tomorrow turned out to be 6 weeks. That was how long the formal investigation ran before it produced anything visible. 6 weeks of sealed proceedings, of investigative team members moving through Fort Blackstone with their credentials and their recording equipment and their carefully worded requests for documents, of Kane and Rowan giving supplemental testimony in rooms that smelled of institutional coffee and careful language, of the unit operating around all of it with the practiced adaptability of soldiers who had learned that the machinery above their level was not always their business, and that doing their jobs well was the most useful contribution available to them. Stoll's administrative access had been fully revoked within 48 hours of the investigation opening. His office had been sealed. His aides had been separated and interviewed individually, which was standard procedure, and which, based on what Selby told Kane in their 3rd supplemental session, had produced information that significantly expanded the scope of what the investigators were looking at. The scope, as it turned out, was larger than either of them had estimated. Shadow Division had not been the only program. It had been the most operationally active, the one with the most direct line between Stoll's authorization and the deaths of specific individuals, but it had existed inside a larger administrative structure that had been running financial fraud against defense procurement contracts for 11 years. The 6 operators were the most recent and most documented victims, but the investigators' timeline stretched back much further, through retirements and transfers and accidents and a handful of deaths that had been ruled natural causes, and were now being re-examined by people with the authority and the mandate to look at them differently. 11 years. Rowan sat with that number in the quiet of her bunk one evening in the 4th week and let herself feel the full weight of what it represented, not abstractly, specifically. 11 years of people doing their jobs well, uncovering things that threatened the machinery, and being removed. 11 years of files with clean official language and authentication codes, and a voice on a secure net saying copy, position confirmed. She sat with it for about 20 minutes. Then she got up and went to the range and shot until the light was gone. The formal charges were announced on a Tuesday. She heard about it from Kane, who heard it from Selby, who called his secure device at 0700 with the particular tone of someone delivering information they have been working toward for a long time and have not permitted themselves to anticipate until this moment. Gareth Stoll had been arrested at his residence at 0530. 7 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, 11 counts of procurement fraud, 4 counts of obstruction of justice, 2 additional counts related to the unauthorized use of classified program authority to conduct domestic operations against military personnel. 3 additional individuals from the Intelligence Coordination Office had been arrested simultaneously. 2 of Stoll's former aides. 1 senior official whose name Rowan didn't recognize, but whose title, when Kane read it to her, placed him 2 levels above Stoll in the administrative hierarchy, which meant the investigation had gone higher than either of them had known the evidence reached. She stood in the armory with Kane and listened to him read the charge summary from his device, and she didn't say anything for a long moment after he finished. "The 6 operators," she said. "The families. The investigative division is making personal contact today, before the public announcement." He looked at his device. "Selby said they've been preparing the notification packages for 2 weeks. They wanted to reach the families before anyone else did." She thought about 6 sets of parents, 6 sets of spouses, siblings, children whose ages she didn't know, people who had been carrying a version of events that was not true, that had been constructed specifically to prevent them from understanding what had happened to the people they'd lost. "Torres had a daughter," she said. She didn't know why she said it. She had never met Torres, had never spoken to him, had only known his name from a roster she wasn't supposed to have. She was 3 when he died. Kane was quiet. "Majewski's wife was pregnant," she said. "He never met his son." "I know. They deserve more than a corrected record." "Yes," he said. "They do." He didn't dress it up with anything. He just said it plainly, the way he said most hard things, and let it be what it was. The record is what we can give them. What they do with it is theirs. She nodded, picked up her cleaning kit, set it back down, picked it up again. "I want to write to them," she said. Kane looked at her. "Not officially, not as part of the investigation, personally." She looked at the cleaning kit in her hands. "I know what I can say and what I can't. I know the limitations, but I want them to know that someone who was inside it, someone who was used by the same machine that killed their people, is aware of what was taken from them and isn't going to pretend the corrected record is equivalent to the truth. The investigative division will have concerns about uncoordinated contact with the families. I'll coordinate it through Selby. I'll let them review what I write." She met his eyes. "But I'm going to write it." Kane looked at her for a moment with the pale, unhurried eyes that cataloged everything. "All right," he said. The public announcement came 3 days later. It was calibrated to the minimum necessary disclosure. Classified program details were withheld, operational specifics were withheld, but the core of it was there. A senior intelligence official and 3 associates had been charged with conspiracy in the deaths of 6 military personnel, among other offenses. The 6 operators were named. Their service was described. The previous finding of enemy ambush was formally withdrawn. They had not died because of failure. The announcement didn't use those words exactly, but the words it used amounted to the same thing, and Rowan read the official statement 3 times on the morning it was released. sitting in the common room with the rest of the unit's morning routine moving around her, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not relief exactly. Something more complicated. The particular feeling of a weight that has been partly removed, lighter than before, but not light, because the removal of a weight doesn't undo the time spent carrying it or restore anything that was lost while you did. Cross sat down across from her with his coffee. He looked at his phone, then at her. "It's out," he said. "Yes." He drank, set the cup down. "How are you doing?" She considered the question. "I'm not sure yet. That's probably the right answer." He turned his phone face down on the table. Delaney heard from someone in logistics that there were federal vehicles at the main gate at 05 this morning, before the announcement. The arrest team. Yeah. He looked at her. "Did you know it was going to be today?" "I knew it was close." He nodded, picked up his cup again. "Rowan." She waited. For what it's worth, the unit knows something significant happened. They don't all know the details, and most of them probably never will. But they know the exercise wasn't an exercise, and they know that someone in this element went up a mountain in the dark and made sure they came home. He said it without performance, the way he said everything that mattered. Nobody's forgotten that. She looked at the table. It wasn't done for recognition. I know. That's exactly why it means something. He stood. "You eating this morning?" "In a bit." He took his cup and left her to the morning, and the statement on her phone and the complicated weight of a thing that was finished without being complete, which was the most honest description she had for what justice actually felt like when you were standing inside it, rather than looking at it from a distance. Selby came back to Fort Blackstone one final time in the 5th week for what she described as a closing interview. It was shorter than the first, 40 minutes, mostly confirmatory questions, the filling of administrative gaps in the evidentiary record. At the end of it, she gathered her recording equipment and produced a sealed envelope from her bag and set it on the table between them. "From the investigative division," she said. "Formal notification of your status in the inquiry." Rowan opened it. The language was dense and official, but the substance was clear. She was formally designated a protected witness and cooperating material witness. Her participation in Shadow Division operations, based on the evidence and testimony reviewed, had been assessed as conducted under coercive operational conditions without knowledge of the program's actual function. The findings did not recommend prosecution. They recommended, in the cautious language of people who understood that recommendations were not restorations, a formal review of her service record. She read it twice, set it down. "What does the service record review mean in practice?" she asked. "It means the record of your detached assignment gets an annotation. What you did during that period is characterized accurately rather than through the program's cover documentation." Selby watched her. "It won't change everything. Some things in official records don't translate cleanly to what actually happened. But it means the next person who reads your file reads an accurate version of the circumstances. And operational restrictions? None. You're clear to continue service in any capacity your current posting supports." She paused. "You'll also be contacted by the division's administrative office about the review process for the 6 operators' official findings. They want the families to receive their corrected records through a coordinated process, and part of that process involves making the circumstances available in a form the families can actually use." She met Rowan's eyes. "Your letters," Selby had reviewed and cleared them earlier in the week, "are going to be included in the packages the families receive. At their discretion, not mandatory, but included." Rowan looked at the envelope on the table. She had written 6 letters. It had taken her 11 drafts to get the first one right, and progressively fewer for the others. Not because the later ones were easier, but because she had found, in the process of writing the first, the specific quality of honesty that the letters required. Not confessional, not defensive, not explanatory in the ways that served her rather than the recipients. Just honest. The kind of honest that acknowledged the full shape of things without asking for anything in return. She didn't know if the families would read them. She didn't know if reading them would help or hurt. She had written them anyway, because the alternative, silence, the administrative correction without a human voice attached to it, felt like the last small dishonesty available to her, and she was done with those. "Thank you," she said. Selby gathered her bag, stood. "One more thing. Off the record." Rowan waited. I've done a lot of these investigations, Selby said. Complex programs, multiple actors, institutional cover running, deep enough that by the time we get to it, most of the evidence is either gone or buried under enough administrative language that extracting the truth is like archaeology. She looked at Rowan with the direct attention she'd had since the first interview. This one resolved the way it did because someone inside the program kept their conscience operational when it would have been considerably easier not to. I don't say that in every case. She picked up her bag. I'm saying it in this one. She went out. Rowan sat in the conference room alone and looked at the envelope and the table and the wall and thought about conscience as an operational capacity. The idea that it was something you kept running or didn't, and that the choice to keep it running had costs that the alternative didn't. She thought that was probably true. She thought the costs were worth it. She wasn't entirely sure she'd thought so 11 months ago, which meant something had changed, and she thought about what had changed it and arrived, somewhat to her own surprise, at an answer that had less to do with the investigation and more to do with 6 weeks at Fort Blackstone and a man who ran drills in the rain and a spotter who drank bad coffee at gates and asked direct questions. She picked up the envelope and went to find Kane. He was in his office, door open, the way it usually was during duty hours. She knocked on the frame anyway. Come in. She sat in the chair across his desk, the one he hadn't offered her on the first day she'd been summoned here, which felt like a different era. He looked at the envelope in her hand. Selby's closing interview, she said. How did it go? Fine. She set the envelope on the desk. They're not recommending prosecution. I know. They told me the same. He leaned back in his chair. He looked, she thought, like someone who had been running at a particular level of sustained internal tension for a very long time, and was only now beginning to feel the absence of it. It didn't make him look relaxed. It made him look older, which was different. The transfer order, she said, the one Stoll filed. It was voided. Yes. But there's no counter order, nothing placing me officially in this unit long term. He looked at her. What are you asking? She thought about how to say what she wanted to say without dressing it in more language than it needed. I've been operating under the assumption that this posting was transitional, that once the investigation resolved, I'd receive reassignment orders and the situation would close. That's a reasonable assumption. I'm asking if it's the only option. Kane was quiet for a moment. He turned a pen over in his hand once, set it down. There's a fire support element instructor position opening in the next cycle. The installation is building a long-range precision training program for junior enlisted coming out of the base qualification pipeline. They need someone who can teach geometry analysis, environmental reading, field positioning under austere conditions. He held her gaze. The kind of things you learned the hard way. She looked at him. It's not a covert program, he said. It's not classified. It's a training billet at a forward installation with a functional unit and a reasonable mess and a secondary range that needs some maintenance. He paused. And it's available, if you want it. She thought about classrooms, about explaining geometry to people who were at the beginning of the learning curve she had long since passed the visible end of, about the particular patience that required, which was a different patience from the kind she used on ridge lines, less about waiting for the right moment, and more about staying present while someone else's understanding developed at its own pace. She thought about Cross saying you should train someone in the dry, direct way he said things that turned out to be correct. The unit would have concerns, she said, about my history, what they know of it. The unit knows someone in this element climbed a mountain in the dark and cleared a kill zone so they could move safely. Kane said it flatly. They've had 6 weeks to form opinions about your history. My assessment is their opinions are not the concern you think they are. She sat with that. Rowan. He said her first name the way he said everything important, without ceremony, just directly. You're good at 2 things. One of them is pulling triggers. The other is understanding why you're pulling them. The second one is rarer. It's also the one that matters more in the long run. She looked at her hands on the desk. The scrape on her palm from the ridgeline descent had healed cleanly. She hadn't noticed when it happened. Yes, she said. Yes, what? Yes, I want the posting. He nodded once, reached for his pen. I'll process the paperwork. She stood, picked up her envelope, got to the door. Kane. He looked up. She tried to find the words for what she wanted to say, which was something about the 14 months he had spent building a case that he had no certainty would ever resolve, in an installation where one wrong conversation could have ended it, against a man with the authority to remove anyone who got too close. Something about what it took to carry a thing like that and keep showing up to work every morning and run formations and manage equipment reviews and behave like a master sergeant at a forward installation when what you were actually doing was building the architecture for something that mattered enormously and might not work. She didn't find the words. There probably weren't good ones. "Thank you," she said instead. He looked at her with the pale, cataloging eyes. "Thank you," he said back. She went out. The first training cycle started 6 weeks after that. 8 junior enlisted, fresh out of their base qualification pipelines, assigned to the long-range precision program for a 12-week intensive. They showed up on a Monday morning looking the way people look at the beginning of something they've been told is difficult, some of them eager in the performative way that didn't last, some of them quietly self-contained, one of them visibly nervous in a way he was working hard to hide, which she noted and set aside to address privately before it became a problem. She had them assemble in the secondary range classroom, 4 tables, a whiteboard, a terrain map pinned to the board at the front. She stood at the front of the room and looked at them, and they looked back at her, and the room was quiet. "My name is Specialist Hale," she said. "I'm going to teach you long-range precision. The technical aspects of it, ballistics, environmental reading, position construction, equipment maintenance, and the other aspects, the ones that don't fit neatly into a manual." Nobody said anything. "The technical parts are learnable," she continued. "They take time and repetition and the willingness to be wrong and figure out why. That's all. Most of you will get there." She looked at them. "The other parts are harder. They require you to think about why you're doing what you're doing, not just what the target designator says, and not just because someone with more rank than you issued an authorization." She paused. "I'm going to say something once, and we're not going to discuss it. And then we're going to move forward. Ready?" A few nods. The nervous one stopped trying to hide it and just sat with it, which she thought was an improvement. "Never pull a trigger because someone told you to," she said. "Pull it because you understand why it needs to be pulled, and you have made that decision yourself with everything you know. If you don't have everything you need to make that decision, ask, demand, refuse until you do." She held the room's attention. "This is going to seem like an unusual thing to hear in a military training environment. I'm telling you it's the most important thing I can teach you. The rest is geometry." Silence. Then, from the back table, a young specialist with sharp eyes and the careful stillness of someone who listened before speaking. "What happens if they won't give you what you need to make the decision?" She looked at him. He looked back at her without flinching, which was a good sign. "Then you've learned something important about the situation you're in," she said, "and you make a decision about that instead." The room absorbed this. She picked up a marker and turned to the whiteboard. "Ballistics," she said. "We start at the beginning." "What?" Cross became her assistant instructor 8 weeks into the first cycle, which was less a formal assignment and more an organic development. He started sitting in on sessions, began answering questions from the junior enlisted during range time, demonstrated techniques with the methodical patience of someone who had recently been on the other side of the learning curve and remembered what it felt like. She asked him about it one afternoon on the secondary range, after the trainees had been dismissed and they were policing the lane. "You're good at this," she said. "The instruction. I'm adequate at it." He was honest about his own limitations and the way that people who were actually good at things usually were. "You're good at it. I'm a useful supplement." "Why are you doing it?" He looked at her sideways. "Because the program's useful. Because the trainees need more than one perspective. And because—" He stopped, considered. "Because watching you explain the geometry analysis to someone who's never thought about it before and watching them get it, that's a pretty good thing to be around." She looked at the range, at the targets at distance, small and precise against the gray berm. "It's different," she said. "Teaching. From everything else I've done. Better or worse." She thought about the nervous trainee from the first day who had turned out to have the steadiest hand in the group once the performance anxiety had somewhere to go that wasn't inward. About the one who had pushed back on her in the 3rd week, not rudely, but genuinely, asking why they were learning a technique she was teaching when a different approach seemed equally valid. And the conversation that had followed, which had been the best conversation she'd had in a training context because the student's question had actually been correct, and she'd told him so and then explained why both approaches worked and when each was preferable. About the look on people's faces when a concept resolved for them, not the eager performance of someone trying to impress, but the quieter thing that came before, when understanding arrived and the face did something involuntary in response. "Different," she said. "Just different." Cross picked up the last brass from the lane. "You're going to be here a while." It was a statement, not a question. She heard the question underneath it anyway. Whether she had made her peace with staying, with the particular shape that staying required, with Fort Blackstone in the secondary range and the whiteboard, and the 8 junior enlisted who were going to become 8 different people by the end of the cycle. "Yes," she said. "Good." He put the brass in the container. "You're better at this than you think you are." "You don't know what I think I am." "No, but I know what I've been watching for 4 months." He picked up the container. "You want coffee? The mess has the good stuff today. Someone in logistics has connections." "Connections to good coffee?" "Apparently. Don't ask." She picked up her kit bag. "Lead the way." The trial began 9 months after the arrests. It was not the kind of trial that produced daily news coverage. The classified nature of the programs involved meant significant portions of the proceedings were sealed, and the public record was a compressed version of something considerably more complicated. Stoll's legal team attempted 3 separate motions to dismiss based on jurisdictional arguments about the nature of classified program oversight authority. All 3 were denied. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Rowan testified on the 3rd day. She drove to the federal facility where the proceedings were held, sat in a waiting room with bad lighting and a coffee machine that was worse than the common room at Fort Blackstone, and then walked into the courtroom and sat in the witness chair and answered questions for 4 hours. She did not look at Stoll during her testimony, not because she couldn't. She was aware of him at the defense table the whole time, a composed presence in a dark suit, the 60% smile gone, replaced by the neutral mask of a man managing his presentation for an audience. She didn't look at him because he wasn't relevant to what she was doing. She was there to tell the truth to people who had the authority to act on it. He was incidental to that process. The prosecution attorney asked her, "Specialist Hale, in your assessment, did you at any point during your operational service in the Shadow Division program have knowledge that the targets you were designated were not, in fact, threats as described in your mission authorizations?" "No," she said. "I did not have that knowledge at the time of the operations." "When did you become aware?" She told the story. The valley, the 12 seconds, the 11 months of carrying it, the passive query at 2300 in the base latrine, the recording of her own voice from a lifetime ago. The courtroom was quiet in the particular way that courtrooms get quiet when testimony is landing in a place that matters. She testified for 4 hours. She answered the cross-examination questions with the same precision she applied to everything, including the questions designed to destabilize, the ones that implied she should have known sooner, that the program's function should have been visible to her, that her cooperation came too late to be meaningful. She answered those the way she answered everything, accurately. "Could you have uncovered the program's actual function earlier?" the defense attorney asked. "Possibly," she said. "I didn't. I believed what I was told because I had been trained to believe it, and because questioning it had costs I wasn't prepared to pay at the time." She met the attorney's gaze without hostility. "I'm not sure that makes me unique." The attorney had no follow-up question. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon. She was on the secondary range with the second training cycle when her phone showed a notification from a news service she'd set an alert on. She dismissed the trainees early, told them range cleaning was postponed to Monday, and sat on the running board of the range vehicle and read the notification. Guilty. All counts. Stole some consecutive sentences on the conspiracy charges, concurrent on the fraud counts. The math added up to something that meant he was not going to leave a federal facility under his own power. His 3 associates had taken separate plea arrangements during the trial, which had contributed materially to the verdict. The other senior official, the one above Stoll, whose arrest had expanded the investigation's scope, had been convicted on the fraud counts and 2 of the conspiracy counts. Lighter sentence. Still significant. She read the notification twice. set the phone down on the vehicle's hood, looked at the range. The targets were still up at the 900-meter line from that morning's drill. Small orange circles at distance, still and exact. The wind was coming off the mountains at a steady pace, the kind of wind she could read in her sleep. She sat with the verdict for a while. It was not satisfying in the way she'd imagined satisfaction before she'd learned what justice actually involved. It didn't undo anything. It didn't return anything. It didn't locate the Torres family's 3-year-old daughter and give her a father, and it didn't give Majewski's son a parent who had known him. What it did was end the machinery. Stop the next file from being written. Close the clean official language that had described 19 authorizations and 6 operators and 11 years of people being removed from the picture for the crime of doing their jobs too well. That was enough. Not sufficient. That word was bigger than what justice could reach. But enough. The kind of enough that you could build something on. She picked up the phone, called Kane. He picked up on the second ring. "I saw," he said. "Yeah." A beat. "You okay?" he said. She looked at the 900-meter targets, at the mountains beyond the range, solid and large, the same mountains she'd been running past every morning for months now, the same mountains that had been there before all of it and would be there after. "Getting there," she said. "You?" "Same. Drinks tonight. The NCO Club, 6 o'clock. "Cross is buying," Kane said. "I already told him. He doesn't know about the verdict yet. He'll know by the time I'm done with this call." She could hear the not-quite smile in his voice, the one she'd taken a long time to recognize as his version of warmth because it didn't announce itself. 6 o'clock. She ended the call, sat for another moment in the afternoon light on the running board of the range vehicle, with the wind reading in her peripheral awareness the way it always did, and the orange targets at 900 meters and the sound of the installation behind her. Formations, vehicles, voices, the ordinary noise of a place that was doing its work. She thought about a 19-year-old version of herself who had joined a program because she was exceptional, and because someone had told her exceptional people were needed, and because she had not yet learned to ask what they were needed for. She thought about what she would tell that version of herself, if the geometry of time allowed for that kind of conversation. She thought she would say, "The questions are not weakness. They're the only weapon that actually matters. Pull the trigger when you understand why, not before." She thought the 19-year-old would have had a hard time hearing it. Most 19-year-olds did. That was not a failure of 19-year-olds. It was the cost of not yet having learned what things cost, which was something you could only really learn by paying. She stood, picked up her kit bag, began the walk back toward the installation. She had a training cycle to prepare for Monday. She had letters she'd promised to write, follow-up correspondence with 2 of the families who had responded to the first letters, careful exchanges that were finding their footing one message at a time, uncertain and imperfect and real. She had a second cycle trainee who was struggling with the environmental reading and needed a different approach than the one she'd been using, and she'd been thinking about how to restructure the explanation in a way that would actually reach him. She had a lot of work to do. The mountains held their position on the horizon, unmoved by verdicts or testimony or the weight of everything that had happened in their shadow over the past year. They were just mountains, rock and elevation and weather, indifferent in the way that large things are indifferent, which was not the same as uncaring and not the same as hostile, just present, enduring. There when you needed something solid to orient by. She walked toward the gate in the fading afternoon light. Tomorrow she would run her route at 5:30. She would teach geometry to people who needed it. She would answer questions, including the hard ones, especially those. She would be wrong sometimes, and she would say so. She would carry what she carried, because some things don't get lighter, they just become more familiar, and familiar was manageable in a way that the first months of carrying had not been. She would do it without being finished, without being fixed, without the clean resolution that stories promised and real life complicated. She would do it anyway, because the dead deserved the truth, and the living deserved someone who had learned from the cost of silence, and that someone, imperfect and still finding her footing, was her. The most dangerous person in any system is not the one who follows every order. It's the one who finally decides to understand why.